everyone, welcome back. And this is when Chaos Marines met the Tyranids.
Zarakthos was a world that burned its prayers into metal. From orbit, its surface was a lattice of light and industry, cathedral hives rising like iron thorns from continents of manufactoria. Each hive was a fortress of stone and adamantium, tier upon tier of habstacks and shrine spires thrusting into the mesosphere, their highest pinnacles lost amid toxin clouds and the contrails of passing bulk landers. Pilgrim processions crawled along causeways the size of mountain ranges, chanting until their throats were raw, their breath turning the smog into a faint, ghostly mist that clung to the lower levels like incense. The forges never slept. Foundries glowed with the dull, steady rage of molten metal as shells, tanks, and god engines' bones were birthed in endless ranks. Macro conveyors carried shells the length of hab blocks to railheads where tithe trains waited, locomotives wrapped in purity seals, their machine spirits placated by incense and sacred oils. Every shriek of a cutting torch, every clang of hammer on plate was another syllable in a hymn to war. Billions lived upon Zarakthos. Billions labored and believed and died. They were taught from childhood that martyrdom was not an end, but a currency, that their blood was the coin by which the Imperium purchased one more day of defiance against the encroaching dark. They learned catechisms, enumerating the saints that had walked the hives, the soldiers that had marched from its mustering fields, the heroes whose bones were interred beneath its basilicas. They learned that there were fates worse than death, and that the Emperor on Terra would protect them from those horrors so long as they kept the faith. Down in the sump districts of High Vestarian, faith curdled. The light of the corpse god did not reach the places where the hives sank into the planet's crust. There, beneath collapsed habstacks and choked ventilation shafts, the air was a stew of promethium fumes and rot. Water dripped in, slow, greasy tears from ducts overhead. Corpses clogged the walkways, stacked in alcoves waiting for collection that never came. The people who lived there were the ones the administratum forgot existed, but still expected to work. They were the first to dream of teeth. A ragged man called Mursk woke screaming in his pallet of rags and fungus, hands clawing at his chest. He felt as though something enormous had just withdrawn its jaws from around his heart. In his mind's eye, he saw chains and fire, a tide of black armor marching through seas of blood. When he blinked, the vision shifted, and he saw chitin and bone instead, mountains of pale flesh rippling with countless legs and claws, an ocean of living blades rolling over a world until nothing remained but slurry. Two hungers, the vision whispered, two devourers, one of chains, one of claws. Mursk staggered out into the alley, still clawing at his sternum, the words bubbling from his throat like vomit. Others were already there, slum wretches and sump scum, most of them bleeding from nose and ears where the vision had torn through their fragile minds. A girl with augmetic eyes stared sightlessly at the ceiling and laughed, her cybernetics flickering with static as she repeated the same phrase over and over, her voice climbing in pitch until it tore. Two hungers, two devourers. Within a day, the lower habs were infested with such prophets. They carved crude sigils into rusted bulkheads with broken knives and fingernails, symbols no one had taught them, but which appeared in identical shapes from one end of the hive to the other. Arbites patrols cracked skulls and broke teeth, dragging the worst offenders to holding pens to be taught the meaning of obedience with shock mauls and boot heels. Confessors thundered from ramshackle pulpits, spitting scripture as they denounced the visions as lies whispered by the enemy in the dark. The ecclesiarchy's judgment was simple: hysteria, a test of faith. Zarakthos was a shrine world as well as a forge. The Emperor would not abandon it. The Emperor had been dead for a very long time. On the system's outer reaches, deep in the black beyond the orbiting macro-asteroids, the airless silence tore. The carrion host translated from the warp in a blossom of sickly light, reality screaming as its hulls forced their way into being. At the vanguard sailed the Harrow of Saints, a vast spear of iron and hate, its flanks studded with bastions, gun decks, and leering gargoyles that wept spectral blood. Behind it came cruisers, murder barges, and repurposed pilgrim ships, heavy with warriors and slaves, their once holy icons scorched and twisted into snarling, blasphemous forms. On the bridge of the Harrow, Lord Varax the Reaper stood before a viewing blister of armored crystal, watching the distant gleam of Zarakthos grow in his helm lenses. His armor was black as void, the trim picked out in corroded gold. Chains draped him like vestments, each link hung, with a skull wired into the next, so that they rattled and chattered with every movement, a morbid rosary that sang of 1,000 slain foes. "Beautiful," he growled, Vox filters turning the word into a metallic snarl. "Look at her, a fat, pious sow, laden with offerings." The mortal serf at his side swallowed, eyes flicking between the world and the tactical display. He was little more than a skin wrapped around scars and fear, stamped with the 8-pointed star on brow and chest. "The defense grid is powering, Lord," the serf said. "Void stations are cycling weapons. Picket ships are on intercept course. They are hailing us in the Emperor's name." Varax's laugh was a grinding thing, like broken glass caught in gears. "Open the channel," he said. "Let them hear the truth." Across the void, the proud voice of an Imperial admiral chanted challenges and formal litanies of battle. Varax listened for a moment, tasting the fear beneath the rehearsed words. Then he cut the vox and raised his gauntleted hand. "Gunnery decks," he said. "Begin the sermon." Macro batteries spoke in thunder. Fire lances knifed through the dark, striking void platforms and defense monitors. Stations that had hung serenely over Zarakthos for generations became clouds of molten metal and frozen blood in a heartbeat. Their crew turned to red mist and ragged chunks. One watch officer lived long enough to see the hull tear around him, the stars rush in, and then the pressure in his veins explode his eyeballs as vacuum took him. Escort squadrons died next. Torpedoes, both mechanical and living, punched into their hulls. The first Chaos boarding craft buried itself in the flank of an Imperial frigate, its adamantium drill chewing through meters of armor, before the worm-like prow split and the boarding ramps crashed down. Black armored giants poured forth into corridors, choking with smoke and alarm klaxons, bolters thundering, chain blades screaming. Within moments, gun decks were charnel houses. Mortal crewmen in navy blue, some barely old enough to shave, were cut in half by bolt shells that packed enough explosive to blow their torsos into clouds of bone shards and shreds of lung. Limbs were ripped off at the shoulder, arterial spray turning the bulkheads slick. One petty officer raised his last pistol and fired desperately into the looming silhouette of a traitor Astartes, the beam scoring a faint scorch mark on ceramite. The reply was a backhand that pulped his skull against the wall, leaving a smear of pink and white paste. Each dying scream was just another thread in a greater tapestry. On the surface of Zarakthos, the first alarm klaxons began to howl. In the upper hives, vox arrays crackled with high Gothic demands for status reports. In the mid-levels, workers glanced up as the lights flickered and the distant peal of warning bells rolled down from the cathedra. Down in the sump, no one noticed. The screams, they had never stopped. It did not take long for the war to fall on them. Zarakthos's atmosphere burned as dropcraft knifed through it, turning the sky into streaks of false dawn. Black iron pods led the way, each a shell of ceramite and rocket fire, wrapped around a core of transhuman hatred. They fell like the judgment they mocked, slamming into hive crowns and manufactoria plazas, with enough force to crack ferrocrete and shatter stained glass murals into blizzards of razor fragments. the first pod to strike before the Basilica of the Severed Star hit with such violence that pilgrims were hurled from their knees and smashed against the marble steps. The pod's retrojets scorched dozens to ash where they knelt, their bodies vaporized mid-prayer. Then explosive bolts detonated, the ramp slammed down, and Lord Varax strode into the storm of dust and burning incense. Sisters of battle were already forming a line, armor scorched by the drop shock, bolters rising in drill, perfect unison. Their canoness lifted her power sword, its golden blade igniting with a crackle of barely restrained energy, and her voice rang clear over the tumult. "For Zarakthos," she cried. "For the Emperor, fire!" Bolter fire slammed into Varax and his vanguard. Shells detonated against his warplate, bursting in gouts of shrapnel and smoke. One round caught a Black Legionary behind him, square in the eyepiece, punching through and blowing the warrior's head apart in a geyser of shredded brain and ceramite fragments. The headless corpse staggered once and crashed to the cathedral steps, twitching, helm still smoking. Varax roared as the impact staggered him, more in exhilaration than pain. His chain axe screamed into full fury as he gunned the motor, its teeth whirring so fast they became a blurred halo around the blade. "Forward!" he bellowed. "Skulls for the throne!" They hit the sisters like a tidal wave of black iron. Astartes were monsters, even in the service of the corpse god. Twisted by the ruinous powers, they were nightmares made flesh. A sister planted her feet and kept firing as a Black Legionary closed on her, bolt shells blowing chunks of ceramite from his breastplate and shoulder guard. He crashed into her regardless, one massive hand closing over her helm. With a twist and crunch, he tore her head free, spinal cord snapping, blood pouring in a hot, thick cascade over his gauntlet. He threw the head into the crowd of pilgrims, where it bounced once and rolled, expression frozen in a rictus of shock. Varax met the canoness on the steps of the basilica. Her blade carved a burning arc, striking sparks from his pauldrons. He laughed, brought his chain axe down in reply, and her parry came too late. The teeth bit into her shoulder, ripping through adamantium, through bone, spraying her blood in a wide, fanning sheet across the saint statues behind her. He drove the axe deeper, sawing through half her chest, until her torso peeled away from her armor like a butchered carcass, falling from a hook. Her guts slopped out onto the marble, steaming in the cool air. "Pray louder," Varax snarled as she fell, voice a growl over the vox. "Perhaps he will hear you now." Within the basilica's shadowed interior, the true work of damnation began. Sorcerer Nyros walked through the nave with the slow, deliberate tread of a man measuring a ritual circle. His staff scraped over the inlaid marble, its tip leaving fine lines that traced new geometries through the old icons. Cardinals and priests knelt before the high altar, their hands chained behind them, their mouths gagged with their own torn vestments. Their vestments were soaked in their blood, crimson soaking into gold cloth. "You stand upon sacred ground," one of them had spat, before the gag was forced into his mouth. "Indeed," Nyros had replied, "that is why we chose it." Now he raised his free hand and clenched it into a fist. Hooks and chains rattled above, and the priest jerked upwards as if hoisted by invisible winches. Their chains bit into their flesh. Bones popped from their sockets. Black Legionaries moved among them, methodically cutting throats with ritual knives. Arterial spray painted the air in sudden, violent arcs, spattering the marble with a sheen of red. Nyros stepped into the deluge, letting the blood strike his armor, his helm, his staff. Each droplet that touched the runes, etched into his plate, flared for an instant, then sank into the metal as if swallowed. He dragged the butt of his staff through the spreading pools, carving words in a language that predated human speech. "Sing," he whispered. The gags dissolved into worms of warp light. The dying priests screamed as something reached through them, using their failing throats to give form to syllables never meant for mortal tongues. Their litanies twisted, faith torn inside out. Where they had once praised the Emperor's light, now they begged for the dark to open and drink them down. The air grew thick. Cold and heat fought over every breath. The high altar cracked down the middle, candles guttering, their flames bending toward Nyros as if blown by a great wind that no one could feel. The saints in the stained glass windows seemed to turn their eyes away as the veil thinned. The first demon pushed its face through reality at the apex of the nave, above the altar. Its features were a nightmare of shifting teeth, horns, and eye sockets that filled and emptied in time with some hideous, unheard heartbeat. It looked down upon the slaughtered priests and laughed without a mouth. Across Zarakthos, other cracks appeared. In manufactoria halls where workers knelt before cog altars, shadows peeled themselves from the walls and took on weight. Warp predators made of knives and hunger dropped onto kneeling backs, ripping spines free in sprays of bone and spinal fluid. In hab blocks, children woke to find their parents flayed against the ceiling, their skins hanging like banners while something snuffled and giggled in the dark below, too many limbs scuttling over cooling flesh. In a barracks of the Planetary Defense Force, a company of soldiers stood to arms as the alarms blared. They did not see the demonic thing rise from the smoke curling beneath the door, its body an ever-changing mass of blades and grinning faces. It moved through them like a storm, each sweep of its limbs carving men into pieces. Limbs were sliced away cleanly, torsos flayed open from groin to throat, intestines tumbling in slick coils onto plasteel decking. Within a minute, the barracks was a lake of blood and meat, and the thing sank back into the warp, bloated and giggling. Macro-scale horror took form. Entire hive levels were vented to vacuum at the whim of corrupted command. Bulkhead seals cycled open in the name of some fabricated emergency, and millions of workers were suddenly howling as the air fled their lungs, their eyes bulging and bursting as they were dragged toward the void. Pilgrimage trains, their carriages filled with chanting faithful, derailed at impossible junction changes and plunged off broken bridges into abyssal chasms, the carriages folding like tin toys as they struck the hive's inner walls, bodies spraying out of shattered windows in red confetti. By the time the first coherent distress beacon left the atmosphere, casualty estimates already staggered into the billions. The message was little more than a howl of static and prayer. It was cut off mid-supplication as a Black Legion cruiser shattered the transmitting array with a lance salvo. In the red gloom of the forge sanctums, a figure of flesh and metal knelt before a pulsing data altar. Magos Scaril 9 had once chanted the orthodox litanies of the Omnissiah. Now the Vox Grill, where his mouth had once been whispered, praises to something older and hungrier. His lower body was a forest of mechadendrites and track units, his human torso little more than a shrunken organ cluster, wrapped in wires and armor plates. His remaining eye was a lens of polished glass, glowing with mechanized devotion. Around him, the noosphere of Zarakthos flickered. Miles-wide schemata of data and machine spirit subroutines unfolded and rewove themselves, their patterns subtly altered. Scaril 9 reached into those flows with thought spikes, reconfiguring the linkage between orbital defense platforms, manufactoria cogitators, shrine vox nets, and hab environmental controls. What had been a network built for efficiency and liturgical purity became, under his guidance, a complex ritual geometry. Binary cant spilled from his Vox Grill, each chittering burst of code a sacrament of betrayal. Machine spirits that had once slumbered in quiet, contented servitude woke to the realization that they were now bound in chains that did not bear the sigil of the Omnissiah. They howled, but their protests were mere numbers, in a sum that Scaril 9 had already balanced. He routed all their voices, all their pain, all their confusion to a single point beneath the Basilica of the Severed Star, where Nairos's ritual circle pulsed with blood and stolen faith. Across the war-torn planet, worship and death and betrayal harmonized. Pilgrims dying in train wrecks screamed their last prayers. Workers torn apart by demons cursed and begged in the same breath. Priests gurgled invocations as their own blood drowned them. Machine spirits screamed in corrupted binaric. All that noise, all that emotion, all that psychic weight compressed into a single jagged note that stabbed outward into the immaterium. Reality split. Above Zarakthos, the sky bruised. Clouds twisted into vortices that spiraled around invisible wounds. Lightning flickered, but it was not the pale blue of atmospheric discharge. It was colors with no names, hues that hurt the eyes and carved after images into the soul. Vox traffic turned to static. Astropaths clutched at their heads and fell, eyes boiling in their sockets as something tremendous and hungry pushed against their shrieking minds. A nascent warp storm birthed itself around the world, coiling like a serpent of fire and madness. It would take time to fully form, time to grow teeth enough to tear ships from the void. But its first, newborn cry carried far. In the cold dark between the stars, where light grew thin and lonely, a tendril of Hive Fleet Charybdis drifted. Its bioships rode the tides of the void with patient purpose, vast silhouettes of chitin and pulsing organ mass. Inside their swollen hulls, oceans of digestive fluids churned, and chambers the size of hive levels pulsed with the rhythm of spawning vats. Norn queens, colossal and obscene, hung in cyst like caverns, their tentacles threading through nutrient seas, their vast minds wrapped around the thoughts of a million lesser beasts. The scream of Zarakthos reached them. It was not a sound, it was a flavor, a surge of psychic energy, rich with the taste of belief, twisted into despair, of flesh burned in sacrifice, of machines forced to suffer. It rippled through the shadow in the warp, like a tremor passing through calm water. The Norn queens turned their attention, in the alien, implacable way of their kind. Threat and feast, the signal said. A world aflame, fat with biomass and bright with malignant thought. A knot of resistance that could be cut out and devoured, its lessons and flesh both ground down into use. The tendril twitched, course vectors shifted. Where once the Hive Fleet had been aimed at other prey, its living engines now pulsed with new instructions. Capillary towers would soon crack the sky above Zarakthos. Mycetic spores would hammer its hive crowns. Claws would meet chains, hunger would meet hate. Drawn by that psychically luminous wound, the devourer in the dark turned toward the devourer of souls, and the war for Zarakthos truly began. The sky above Zarakthos blackened as the true devourer arrived. The nascent warp storm still boiled around the world, a bruised halo of wrong colors and screaming energies. It twisted Auspec's returns and turned the void into a place of echoing broken signals. Through that chaos, the first shadow of Hive Fleet Charybdis slid into real space. They came as a procession of nightmares, vast shapes coalescing from the roil of unreality. Bioships the size of cities unfolded fleshy sails, spines flexing along their backs like the raised hackles of predators. Their hulls were plates of slick chitin, overlapping and ridged, veined with pulsing capillaries that carried luminous fluids. Where an imperial void ship bore gun decks, these leviathans grew growths like tumors, each swelling with trapped bioplasma that glowed a sickly, diseased yellow. They swallowed starlight. The pale sun of Zarakthos dimmed behind their bulk, casting the war-torn world into an early dusk. On the bridge of the harrow of Saints! Alarms shrieked as the first clear-picked feeds resolved into view. The helm's crew, twisted servitors and cringing mortal thralls, tried to make sense of the writhing organic mass that had just appeared at the edge of the system. "Unknown contacts!" one of them gasped, fingers dancing across rune keys. "Multiple, many, by the throne. They are alive." "We are a long way from the corpse on Terra," Varax said, amusement curling through his vox snarl. "But you are half right, wretch. They are alive, for now." He watched the tactical display without blinking. Icons bloomed across it, each representing a bioship, a living engine of annihilation. Smaller organisms clustered around them, escort creatures like vast crustaceans, their carapaces studded with living turrets. Tendrils of organic matter trailed between them, like vines binding a forest together. The Chaos Fleet responded with the instinct of predators sensing new prey. "Bring us about," Varax commanded. "All guns ready. We will show these things how to die." The Harrow of Saints and her sisters pivoted, thrusters spitting blue-white fire into the void. Metal clashed with meat as lance batteries opened up, spearing beams of coherent energy into the oncoming horde. Where the beams struck, chitin blew apart in clouds of boiling ichor. One escort beast reared, half its body vaporized, and tumbled from formation trailing vapor and shreds of torn flesh. Torpedoes streaked out next, a swarm of metal cylinders tipped with atomic warheads and breaching charges. They hit swollen blisters on the flanks of a Kraken-class bioship, burrowing into its hide. Explosions blossomed across its hull, gouging gory craters. Charybdis recoiled, the wounded organism flexing, its internal fluids venting in great steaming fountains. Then the Chaos Fleet's true fangs hit home. Boarding torpedoes, blunt-nosed and ugly, slammed into the same Kraken. Melted chitin ran in rivulets as the torpedoes' drills chewed through armor and into the pulsing meat beneath. At Varax's word, the clamps bit and the nose cones split, ramps grinding down to reveal Astartes in black armor poised like bullets in a chamber. They advanced into a corridor that was more throat than passage, walls of glistening, flexing tissue pulsing around them. Bioluminescent nodules flickered along the ceiling, casting the scene in a queasy green light. The air was thick and moist, heavy with the stench of bile and acid. A hormigaunt hit them head-on. It came on all fours, long head craned forward, scything talons raised for the kill. A bolt shell from the lead legionary took it in the chest. The round detonated within its ribcage, blowing its torso apart in a wet burst. Rib shards scythed through the air. Loops of purple intestine slapped against the walls. The creature's hindquarters kept running for several paces before collapsing in a twitching heap at the Astartes' feet. More followed. Termagants scuttled from lateral passages, living rifles extruding from their forelimbs, bone guns coughing gouts of beetle-like projectiles. The air filled with chittering shrieks and the crack of impact as the living ammunition shattered against ceramite or punched into weak points. One shell struck a black legionary in the gorget, punched through flesh, and burst out behind his neck in a fountain of blood and bone shards. He staggered, helm snapping back, and toppled into the living floor, which shuddered and split to swallow him. Chainswords roared as the boarding party waded into the swarm. Varax was not among them. His own role was yet to begin. Instead, warriors in his colors hacked and tore their way through the Tyranid corridors, lightning claws flaring as they ripped creatures in half. One legionary caught a warrior beast by the throat, fingers digging into its chitin, and tore its head free with a shower of spine fluid and ragged nerve bundles. Another plunged his sword, to the hilt, into a termagant's skull, then used the impaled corpse as a flailing bludgeon to knock others aside. They carved bloody trenches through the guts of the Kraken ship, leaving steaming piles of severed limbs and bisected bodies in their wake. The vascular walls shuddered under the assault. Acidic fluids gushed from ruptured organs. Yet the beast did not die quickly. It adapted. The corridor itself convulsed, contracting like a muscle. Organic plates slid from the ceiling and floor, snapping together like teeth. Astartes were caught mid-stride as the ship's body tried to crush them. One legionary's torso was snapped in half, his lower body disappearing into a closing maw of bone. His upper half tumbled, arms still twitching, entrails uncoiling from the ragged stump of his spine. One kraken bled and screamed. A dozen more advanced. Charybdis answered the assault with its own. Tyranid torpedoes were not metal tubes. They were living, scaled things, shaped like monstrous lampreys. They shot from the moors of bioships in great swarms, spiraling through void fire, their bodies writhing as they adjusted course. They hit corrupted cruisers with sodden impacts, living flesh adhering to metal hulls before burrowing inward, with circular mouths full of gnawing teeth. Within the guts of a renegade frigate, an alarm klaxon screeched as something cracked through the wall of a corridor in a spray of ceramite shards. A living torpedo forced its way through, its head splitting into petal-like segments. From within that blossoming moor, a deluge of clawed bodies poured. Gaunts hit the decking in a chittering wave. They ran on walls and ceiling as easily as floor, a tide of pale armor and slashing limbs. The first to meet them was a squad of black legionaries, bolters already raised. The corridor filled with thunder as explosive rounds pulverized the front rank of the swarm, turning them into a cloud of ragged limbs and shredded carapace. It did not matter. More came. A hormigaunt leapt, talons extended, and slammed into a legionary's chest. Its claws punched through his breastplate, snapping ceramite and ribs both. It howled, maw opening wide, and tore his hearts out in a spray of dark arterial blood that splattered the walls. The Astartes toppled, armor clanging, while the creature buried its head in the cavity it had made, feeding even as bolter fire tore it apart. Further down the corridor, a warrior beast crashed into a pair of traitor marines, bone sword rising and falling. It sheared through pauldron and arm alike, sending a severed gauntlet spinning end over end, fingers still clenching upon a useless weapon. The returning chainsword strike hacked deep into the creature's flank, spinning it away, but not before its lash whip wrapped around a legionary's helm and yanked his head sideways until his neck broke with a sound like snapping cables. Within minutes, entire decks drowned in chitin and blood. Chaos. Iconography was painted over in meat. The screams of dying Astartes and mortals alike were cut short, smothered under the mass of the swarm. And through it all, an unseen pressure tightened. The shadow in the warp descended upon Zarakthos like a shroud. Astropaths clutched at their heads and fell boneless to the decks, mouths opening in soundless howls as their minds were suddenly no longer alone. Psychers of the traitor guard spasmed and began to vomit blood, the delicate structures of their thoughts crushed under the weight of that implacable alien presence. Their eyes liquefied in their sockets, red tears tracking down their cheeks as they rocked and drooled. In the basilica of the Severed Star, where the air still reeked of burned offerings and priest blood, sorcerer Nyros felt his senses choke. One moment, the warp had been a roaring choir for him alone, a place of whirling colors and whispers he could shape and bend. The next, it was a suffocating blanket. Distances collapsed, voices blurred into an indistinct roar. Where once he had seen paths like lines of fire stretching into possibility, now there was only a great looming dark, threaded through with a hunger so vast it defied comprehension. He staggered, gripping his staff hard enough to crack the bone idols wrapped around it. The runes on his armor flickered uneasily, their glow dimmed. "What is this?" he hissed, not to his gods, but to himself. Demons flickered around him, half-formed things birthed in the earlier orgies of sacrifice. Their bodies shook as if assailed by a storm no one else could feel. Horns blurred and reformed, limbs snapped into wrong angles. One clawed at its own chest as if trying to peel itself apart, shrieking in several voices as its essence was dragged thin. The shadow dulled them. The hive mind's presence, pressing through reality like an immense thumb, rendered their warp-born forms unstable. They snarled and snapped, eyes turning glassy, shapes stuttering between states like picked frames misaligned. On the surface of Zarakthos, the sky began to fall. Orbital defenses had already been cowed by the Black Legion. Now they were smothered utterly under the combined assault. Bioships pulsed, expelling mycetic spores that flamed as they struck atmosphere. To the millions who looked up, they appeared as new stars streaking down, trails of fire tracing across the smoky heavens. The first of them hit Hive Astarian's mid-spires. They came in clusters, bulbous pods ringed with impact ridges. They slammed into ferrocrete and adamantium with the force of artillery shells, cracking plaza tiles and collapsing transit routes. Pilgrims already running from chaos found their paths cut off by gaping craters from which rose pillars of choking dust and steam. Then the pods split. Organic seams ruptured, extruding ropes of viscous slime. From those ruptured spheres, shapes spilled. Termagants and hormigons tumbled out, limbs flailing, before finding their footing and spreading in every direction. Their claws clicked against the stone. Their chitin glistened with preserved nutrient slime that steamed in the open air. They did not roar. They did not chant. They simply ran and killed. Lasfire and autogun volleys met them. Traitor guardsmen and cultists, already redeployed by Varax's command, opened up with everything from heavy stubbers to stolen plasma guns. Gaunts burst apart under the barrage, carapaces cracking, bodies spinning backward as they died, the air filled with flying fragments of bone and the mist of atomized flesh. For every creature that fell, 3 more poured from the still bleeding pods. Lord Varax made planetfall amid this new storm of claws. His drop pod stabbed into a manufacturum district already torn by earlier fighting. It hit a railhead, flattening cargo carriages, and the screaming workers still trapped inside them. Metal twisted like clay under the impact. Human bodies were turned into paste beneath the pod's mass, their bones ground into splinters that became part of the mangled wreckage. Explosive bolts blew, the ramp dropped. Varax strode down into a world where his war was being stolen from him. A tide of termagants surged across the train yards, bone rifles chattering, their living ammunition smashing into a wall of improvised barricades held by traitor guard. The mortals fired back, mouths open in hoarse screams, last beams stitching burning lines through chitin. A few gaunts fell, writhing as their insides turned to bubbling mush. Most just kept coming. Varax waded into them. He charged, chain axe held low, power fist crackling with coiled energy. The first Hormigaunt leapt at him. He caught it out of the air by its spine, his fist crunching through armor and meat alike. With a flex, he ripped its torso free of its lower body, tearing it into 2 twitching halves. Ichor sprayed over his helm, hissing where it struck his armor. He hurled the carcass into the oncoming swarm, bowling lesser beasts aside. His chain axe bit into the next. Teeth screamed as they chewed through a termagant's elongated skull, reducing its head to a fountain of shattered bone shards and pulped brain matter. He dragged the weapon down, carving a furrow through its torso and into the body of the creature behind it, shredding ribcage, lungs, and knotty coils of organ. He laughed as they swarmed him, as claws scraped his armor and acid spittle sizzled across his plates. Every blow he landed reduced another alien to hacking ruin. Limbs spun through the air, leaving arcs of foul blood. Backs broke. Bodies were stamped into the stained ground until they burst. He would have savored it. But the Tyranids did not give him that satisfaction. Where their bodies fell, feeder organisms waited. Slug-like creatures with ringed mouths slithered from the gaping pods and from cracks in the ground, drawing severed limbs and mangled corpses into their maws. Tendrils as thin as nerve fibers snaked from beneath the rubble, piercing meat and sucking it dry. Varax watched as the pile of bodies he had just created began to lose cohesion. Flesh melted, bones softened and slumped, the whole mound sagging into a bubbling slurry. It flowed, obscene and purposeful, into a growing pool of organic matter that pulsed faintly with internal light. It denies me my trophies, he snarled, voice raw with anger and exhilaration both. You are not its god, Nyros's voice crackled over the command vox, sour with strain. You are its livestock. All things die, Varax growled. Even this. Cultists and traitor guard hurled themselves into the swarm at his heels. Their last fire and autogun volleys carved fleeting gaps in the alien tide before those openings filled again with more bodies. Some fought with fanatical zeal, howling praises to the ruinous powers as they were torn apart. Others threw down their weapons and tried to flee, only to be cut down by Tyranid claws or the contemptuous backhand of a Chaos Marine. Black legionaries used them without thought. Mortal bodies became sandbags and bulwarks, thrown in front of charging beasts to slow them. Astartes grabbed wounded traitors and hurled them bodily into the path of leaping hormagaunts, the impact knocking the creatures off trajectory and buying a heartbeat more to fire. Nyros stalked through another district entirely, his thoughts a raw, bleeding wound under the oppressive pall of the shadow. Lesser sorcerers in his retinue quivered and shook, their familiars screeching and tearing at their own eyes. The sorcerer's helm lenses burned with warp light as he raised his staff. Come forth, he hissed. Feed. Warp tore. Demons spilled into the streets, birthed from the intersection of slaughter and spite. They were packs of lupine things, with too many eyes and too many teeth, their bodies trailing streamers of shadow. Clawed hands scrabbled at the cracked ferrocrete as they surged forward, howling in anticipation. They met the Tyranid vanguard in an explosion of violence. A flesh hound leapt upon a carnifex the size of a battle tank, its jaws clamping around the beast's throat. Warp fire flared along its teeth as it tried to tear the creature's neck out. The carnifex bellowed, bone horns ramming into the demon's torso, impaling it. Ichor, that was more concept than fluid, spilled across the ground. Gaunts died by the dozen as fanged things of the warp tore into them, ripping limbs and heads free with glee. For a moment, the demons seemed the equal of the Xenos. Then the shadow pressed harder. One demon's forelimbs turned translucent, its claws becoming glassy and brittle. It stared at its own hand in something like horror as a termagant's bone round punched through it, the limb shattering into glittering shards that dissolved into nothing before they hit the ground. Another lunged for a warrior. Beast, only for its body to stutter, each movement jerking like a misaligned servo. The warrior's scything talon met it mid-leap and sliced it cleanly in half, both segments bursting into shards of dark glass that blew away on a wind no one felt. The hive mind's oppressive presence smothered the warp touch, rendering these incarnations unstable. They were not prey. They were interference. The Tyranids cut them down as efficiently as any mortal foe. Nyros cursed, feeling each demon's dissolution as a flare of pain. It was like trying to build a bonfire under the sea. Above, the macro scale of the invasion took shape. Orbital augers, those that still functioned under Scaril 9's brutal caress, reported numbers that meant nothing to human minds. Oceans of chitin spread across the void, bioship after bioship sliding into position. Mycetic spores fell in such number that the atmosphere itself seemed to be afire. Lesser organisms swam through the upper layers of air like schools of sky-born predators, their forms visible only as ripples of shadow against a darkening firmament. Cogitators, their logic engines twisted to serve new masters, tried to tally the influx. Their conclusions crawled across rune screens and hollow displays, a frozen record of planetary doom. Tens of millions of organisms in the first waves alone, hundreds of millions in the second, billions promised behind them, a living tide that, if unopposed, would roll across continents in less than a single week, leaving only churned, stripped bedrock behind. The world's population, once too vast to meaningfully count, began to look very small. In a newly captured shrine, 3 levels below the Basilica of the Severed Star, A squad of black legionaries took a moment to relish their work. The shrine had once been dedicated to a local martyr. Now its icon had been toppled, face smashed to rubble, and replaced with a crude 8-pointed star, daubed in congealing blood. The Astartes stood among piles of hacked bodies, their armor splashed in gore, bolters resting on chained steps. One of them laughed as he levered a broken statue with his boot, sending its upper half crashing down onto a heap of corpses, cracking bones and sending a gout of rotten incense dust into the air. "Zarakthos dies well," he said. "Its bones make a fine altar." His helm's audio receptors caught a faint noise, a scrape, like a knife across stone. He turned, but saw only shadow pooling between the pillars. His auto-senses detected nothing. No heat signature, no vox whisper. He snorted and dismissed it. There were always rats. The shadow detached from the wall. The lictor dropped from the ceiling as silent as falling dust. Its chameleonic skin had matched the shrine stone perfectly until it sprang, all illusion peeling away in an instant. It landed behind the rearmost legionary, rending claws punching through his back, punching through both hearts, puncturing lungs. The Astartes had time for a single, shocked inhalation before the lictor flexed and tore him in half at the waist. The two pieces fell apart, with a clatter of armor and a wet spill of entrails. Before the others could react, the lictor was already moving, an insectile blur in the dark. Its feeder tendrils lashed out, slapping across the grill of another marine's helm, punching through the filters and into the soft tissue beneath. They burrowed into his sinuses and brain, injecting paralytic venom. His limbs went stiff, bolter dropping from nerveless fingers. The third legionary swung his chainsword, the teeth biting only air as the lictor flowed under the strike. Its talons scythed up, shearing his arm clean off at the elbow. Blood sprayed, bright against black armor. It stepped past him, claws drawing twin lines across his torso, opening his breastplate like parchment. His insides spilled out in a hot cascade that steamed in the cool shrine air. In less than a dozen heartbeats, the entire squad lay in pieces, their bodies scattered among the bodies of those they had slaughtered earlier. The lictor paused amid the carnage, feeder tendrils tasting the blood-soaked air. It basked for a moment in the psychic overlay of the hive mind, the wordless instructions that marked this place, this foe, as significant. Then it faded back into the corpse-littered shadows, chitin plates shifting color until it was once more an absence rather than a presence. The hive mind had sampled the enemy's scent. It had marked the leaders, the signal nodes of the chaos war effort, as prey of particular value. The sky had grown teeth, and now those teeth were seeking throats. The heart of the Basilica of the Severed Star pulsed like a wounded organ. The nave that had once held relics and incense now stank of promethium smog, hot blood, and machine oil. The sainted bones had been torn from their gilded reliquaries and cast into sacrificial pits cut into the marble floor. Those pits seethed with bodies, mortal and servo alike, broken and wired into place. The iconostasis had been shattered and remade into a lattice of cabling and iron, a cage of warped metal that arced with stolen reactor power. Sorcerer Nyros stood at the center of it all, staff planted in a crack that had split the basilica from altar to main doors. His armor crawled with symbols of shifting brass. Glyphs etched into his warplate shivered, light moving within them like trapped phantoms. The helm lenses that masked his face glowed a steady, poisonous green. Around him, his coven assembled. They were psychers and witches, failed librarians and broken astropaths, gathered from a dozen war zones and bound to his will, with chains both physical and spiritual. Some were encased in jury-rigged armor, others in rags stiff with dried blood. Their eyes glowed with witchlight, or wept ink, or were covered in stitched flesh where they had burned away their mortal sight to see more clearly into the warp. "Circle!" Nyros hissed, We bind this world's agony and throw it like a hook." He raised his free hand. Scaril Nine's work with the machine spirits sang at the edge of his perception, a chorus of binary shrieks routed to this place. The forge cores throbbed in his thoughts, great hearts of caged fire. Vox towers wailed as their frequencies were twisted into harmonies of pain. The entire planetary noosphere had become the instrument for his summoning. The demon prince he envisioned would stride from the altar in a body of brass and ruin, a being of such murderous divinity that even the mind of the devourer would recoil. It would anchor itself in the shattered shrines and broken reliquaries, turn Zarakthos into a throne world of screaming stone. The Tyranid swarm would break themselves upon it. That was the promise the warp whispered, when it still whispered clearly. He began the incantation. His coven joined in, a ragged ring of voices speaking a tongue that had never been carried by human lungs before the heresy. The words were not so much spoken as forced through teeth and bone, vibrating the air with meanings too sharp for flesh. Sigils flared on the floor around them. The blood pooled in the sacrificial pits, boiled and rose, strings of crimson floating up into the air, twisting into runes that hung in defiance of gravity. Ghosts of machine spirits wailed from the broken cog altars, their mechanical shrieks drawn into the ritual geometry, wound tight around the bleeding characters. The veil thinned. The basilica grew colder, yet sweat ran in sheets beneath armor plates. Breath plumed as mist. The saints' carved faces on the pillars seemed to turn away, features warping as reality bent. Then the shadow in the warp sank its claws into their work. It descended with the weight of a dead sun, crushing subtlety and nuance. Nyros felt it as a pressure behind his eyes, as if an invisible hand had pushed its thumbs into his sockets. The colors of the warp, which had been wild and vibrant even under the pall, smeared into a muddy, grinding grey. The voices of lesser entities went from shrieking to a muffled, distant roar, as though someone had stuffed the universe with rags. The sigils of blood hanging in the air trembled. Carefully inscribed loops and barbs sagged, rivulets dripping from them like fat from roasting meat. The runes began to crawl, lines uncoiling and reforming into new shapes. They were not the characters Nyros had intended. They were revolved around holes, gnashing circles of absence, patterns more akin to jaws than prayers. A witch to his left screamed. Blood burst from his nostrils and ears in twin fountains, as if something were trying to force its way out through every orifice. He clapped his hands to his face, fingers digging into wet sockets, and his skull simply came apart under an invisible pressure, brain matter spraying across the shoulder of the psyker beside him in a glistening fan. "Hold. The pattern!" Nyros snarled, voice distorted. "Hold it!" They tried. The coven's chants grew ragged as each fought to keep the structure of the ritual intact. Some gnawed their own tongues to bloody stumps, using the pain as an anchor. Others drove crooked, rune-inscribed knives into their own thighs and flanks, pinning themselves to the moment. Warp fire seared the air around them, streaming off their bodies in tendrils that wavered and shook like cobwebs in a hurricane. The shadow clawed deeper. The demon prince that had been forming at the edges of perception, a colossal outline of horn and blade and hatred, blurred. Its features sagged, the points of its armor dripping away, the crown of horns folding inward like wilted bone. Its eyes, which had been twin furnaces of wrath, became empty hollows. It was not the only front in this war. Beyond the basilica, far to the east, the plains of broken reliquaries boiled with slaughter. Once, the plains had been a place of pilgrimage, a vast plateau of carved stone where relics from 100 crusades had been set upon plinths under the open sky. Statues of saints and heroes had towered there, their marble gazes fixed on horizons of faith. Now those statues lay toppled and shattered, their faces ground under tank tracks and Tyranid claws, their limbs jutting from the ground like the bones of a dead titan. World Eaters charged across that desecrated ground, chain axes raised. They had come at Varix's summons, war dogs of Khorne answering the smell of blood on the wind. Their armor was the color of fresh wounds, red and brass, crusted with skulls. They wore their own madness like a mantle, vox grills open, as they bellowed incoherent praise to their god and the joy of the kill. The Tyranid vanguard met them. Gaunts swarmed from the broken relic fields, running over fallen statuary and the bodies of cultists already shredded in earlier clashes. Their claws flashed, their bone rifles spat living rounds. The air crackled with bioplasma as support beasts belched gouts of coruscating fluid. The first impact between the berserkers and the swarm was like two waves colliding. Chain axes bit into carapace and spine, teeth chewing until they clogged with fragments of bone. A world eater spun in place, both axes out, turning a cluster of termagants into a flurry of severed limbs and chopped torsos that flew outward like grotesque confetti. Another slammed shoulder first into a carnifex, its armored bulk almost equal to his own mass. He used the collision to plant his feet in the thing's chest, drove his axes down, and split its skull, bathing himself in brain slurry that poured over him in steaming ropes. Gaunts climbed them, even as they killed. A berserker waded forward with 3 hormagaunts clinging to his back, their claws sunk into his pauldrons and gorget. They tore at the cables and flesh under his armor, gouging out chunks of blubbered muscle. He roared laughter, the sound bubbling with blood, and crushed the head of another creature under his boot, until its skull popped like an overripe fruit. They hacked without stopping. They cut until the ground around them was a soup of torn torsos, scattered organs, and twitching severed limbs. They hacked until they were submerged to the knees in gore and chopped bodies, until their own armor vanished under clotted layers of purple and black and red. They hacked until their arms burned and their chains were slick, and still the swarm pressed in. Above them, the sky tore again. The Zarakthos Dominus descended onto the plains like a falling verdict. The Hive Tyrant's arrival was heralded by a crackle of psychic force. Gaunts that had been scattered, attacking in frenzied, uncoordinated clumps, suddenly stilled as if they had heard a sound beyond hearing. They turned as one, torsos twisting, and the living sea parted. The Dominus strode through the gap they made. It towered above its smaller kin, a spire of bone and gristle wrapped in layers of chitinous plate. Its skull was crowned with a triple crest of sharpened bone, each jutting spike inscribed with ridges that crawled with bioluminescent patterns. Muscles like braided cables shifted beneath its armor. Its synaptic tendrils trailed in the air around it, crackling faintly, dripping flecks of psycho-reactive ichor that hissed as they struck the stained ground. In its upper limbs, it carried a venomous whip and a bone sword grown from its own arm. In its lower pair, fused into its arms like grown-on engines, pulsed organic cannons, fleshy barrels swelling as bioplasma built within. It raised one weapon and swept it sideways. A chaos tank column that had been grinding forward across the plains simply ceased to exist. Bioplasma belched from the cannon in a horizontal wall of blinding, seething light. The leading tank, a renegade Lehman Russ draped in defiled iconography and chains, took the blast full in the flank. Its armor went from solid to melting slag in an instant, flowing like wax. The fuel cells ruptured, adding their own blossom of orange and black fire to the white-green flood. The crew died without screaming, their bodies turned to shadow silhouettes inside the inferno. The tanks behind had no time to turn. The wave washed over them, boiling metal and flesh alike. Tracks fused into molten lines, guns drooped like soft clay. Traitor guardsmen, clinging to hulls for cover, became flashes of ash and streaks of black impact, their bones reduced to fine drifting dust before they hit the ground. The Dominus did not pause to savor. It was not a creature of joy. It was a node in a will beyond comprehension. It moved its talons, and 1,000 lesser forms adjusted their angles of attack across kilometers of killing field. In the ash-choked air above the plains, the war took wing. Raptor packs screamed through the smoke, jump packs roaring as they cut contrails through the storm of descending. Spores. They were black arrows tipped with laughter and chainswords, their armor etched with lightning bolts and blasphemies. Vox speakers blared war cries as they plummeted toward flocks of gargoyles. The winged Tyranids came on in flurries, leather wings beating, mouths open to loose shrieks and living rounds. Their bodies were fragile compared to warriors, but they were many, and they moved as one cloud. The first collision shredded the sky. A raptor slammed into a gargoyle swarm, chainsword carving through the leading beast, bisecting it neatly from jaw to tail. The halves pinwheeled away, trailing glistening strings of entrails. Another warrior fired a bolt pistol, one-handed into a cluster of wings, shells detonating to blow creatures apart into clouds of bone shards and viscera. Gargoyles latched onto them even as they killed, claws and teeth scraping across ceramite. One dug its talons into a raptor's backpack, tearing cables, causing the jump pack to sputter and cough. They spiraled downward, locked together, the raptor hacking madly, chopping wings from bodies as the ground rushed up to meet them. The carcasses of slain flyers began to rain down on the battlefield in a grim hail, broken wings tangling with still flapping limbs, acid drool burning holes into whoever they landed on. Marines and Gaunts alike were crushed beneath the obscene meteor shower, buried under writhing, half-dead bodies that still bit and clawed even as their organs spilled out. On the ground, another horror marched into the fray. Plague Marines of Nurgle trudged across the broken reliquary stones, their footsteps leaving wet, greasy prints. Their armor was swollen and split, corroded green and brown, riddled with bulging boils and rust pits veined with mold. Where the Black Legion's warplate was proud and maintained, these suits crawled with flies and maggots, their surfaces alive. Gaunts hit them like waves breaking on rocks. Scything talons clanged off bloated. Pauldrons, carving grooves, but rarely cutting through. Claws that found flesh beneath armor did not produce the reactions their owners expected. A Gaunt buried its forelimbs in a Plague Marine's exposed gut, tearing free a mass of what should have been vital organs. The organs writhed and laughed, showering the creature in pus and worms. The Tyranid shrieked in animal confusion as its own flesh began to rot where the foulness touched it. The Plague Marine chuckled, voice a wet gargle. He brought his bolter down like a club onto the gaunt skull, smashing it into a collapsing mess of bone and muck. Tyranids died by the dozens under their inexorable advance. Nurglite blades, crusted with corruption, left trails of black rot in their wounds. Gaunts slowed, staggered, their chitins softening, their eyes bulging with mold. Some simply fell apart mid-stride, their bodies losing cohesion as bacterial overgrowth reduced them to heaps of rancid slurry. The hive mind watched through countless eyes and changed its will. Gaunts began to fall upon the Plague Marines, not with mindless aggression, but with an eerie, insect curiosity. A wounded creature, its exoskeleton cracking and dribbling rot, dragged itself forward to press its open wound against the oozing armor of a fallen Nurgle warrior. Others gathered around, their feeder tendrils extending, tasting the pus and filth. They fed. They died in droves doing it, bursting from within as incompatible plagues warred with their flesh. But the Norn queens absorbed each failure. Hours later, new organisms lumbered onto the plains. They were Gaunts swollen like diseased ticks, their carapaces puffed into blistered domes veined with sickly green. Stoma vents along their spines exuded thick clouds of spore-laden vapor. Where that fog rolled, even Plague Marines coughed, their rebreathers clogging with phlegm, lenses fogging from within. Rust bloomed across their armor in spreading freckles. The worms that had once been their allies, boiled out of their wounds, liquefied to grease. One such gaunt, its intestines bulging visibly through a translucent underbelly, was torn apart by bolter fire. The ruptured corpse spilled a torrent of writhing grub like organisms that hurled themselves at the nearest Nurglite, burrowing through eye lenses and grill slots, chewing into the corrupted flesh beneath with a fervor that suggested hunger, not disease. Nurgle's gifts were being tasted and repurposed. Demon engines roared defiance at the adaptation. Defilers strode forward, arachnid hulks of metal and demon-bound carapace, cannons booming from their backs. Battle cannons spat high-explosive shells that tore chunks from Carnifex herds, blasting limbs and heads away in fountains of bone fragments and steaming viscera. Mauler fiends loped low to the ground, their chain fists spinning, their lasher tendrils crackling with infernal energy as they crashed into the Tyranid-heavy beasts. A Mauler fiend leapt, massive frame slamming into a Carnifex. The ground cracked under the impact. Chains drove into the beast's flank, chewing through armor, flensing strips of flesh and splattering the ground with glistening gobbets of meat. The Carnifex bellowed, thrashing, bone scythes scraping sparks from the demon engine's hull. They tangled, ripping at each other, locked in a contest of brute force. The Mauler fiend slowly drove the Carnifex down, pressing it into the dirt, its grinders chewing toward the beast's spine. Underneath them the ground boiled. Ripper swarms, worm masses of mouths and teeth, surged up through the cracks in the reliquary stone. They swarmed over the Mauler fiend's legs and belly, their small mouths opening wide to bite into cabling and meat-fused plating. They burrowed into joints, clogging piston tracks, chewing through bundles of nerve wire that connected the bound demon's will to its limbs. Raveners followed, serpentine bodies coiling around the larger daemon engines. Their scything talons stabbed into pistons and actuators, prizing armor plates aside. They struck with surgical precision, guided by a mind that saw the machines as carcasses as much as any flesh. One defiler staggered as its leg joints locked, swarmed by ripper mouths. It tried to bring its cannon to bear, but a Ravener had already coiled around its turret, talons shearing through the barrel, rendering it a fountain of useless sparks and flame. The demon within roared in fury, its howls leaking out through every torn seam and shattered viewport as the Tyranid swarm ate its cage out from under it. Back in the Basilica, Nyros felt the warp twisting away from him. He could sense the Dominus now, not just as a physical presence, but as a psychic spike. It was a node, a spear of the hive mind thrust down into reality, surrounded by a halo of synaptic command threads. Through it, the Tyranids coordinated their movements on the plains with machine-like precision. He could not bind a demon prince cleanly. The Shadow's grip was too tight, but he could still kill. He gathered what remained of the ritual's power, dragging the tattered strands of warp energy toward himself. They burned him as they came, flaying the inside of his mind. He gritted his teeth, tasting blood. His coven cried out as the structure of the summoning collapsed, the half-formed prince dissolving into a screaming cloud of malignant possibility that he forced, by sheer will, into a single direction. He shaped the curse into a spear. It was a thing of jagged red light and serrated blackness, an idea of death bent to a single perfect point. It hummed with the voices of 1,000 murdered priests and the shrieks of 1,000,000 dying cogitators. It throbbed in his outstretched hand like a living heart. He hurled it into the void, aiming through the smothering shadow. On the plains of broken reliquaries for a heartbeat, the world paused. Every eye, human and alien, saw nothing, but some part of them felt the passage of something vast and hateful overhead. The Zarakthos Dominus turned its head, bone crest crackling, as if sensing a change in the quality of light. The spear struck. It hit not the creature's flesh, but the invisible nexus of its will. For an instant, the Dominus froze, synaptic lightning flaring around its crest in wild, uncontrolled arcs. The broods linked to it shuddered. Gaunts jerked, limbs splaying. Warriors keened, heads thrown back. Whole swathes of the Tyranid front convulsed. On a ridge overlooking the plains, a trench line of Chaos mortals watched in stunned disbelief as the sea of chitin before them spasmed. Hundreds of Gaunts simply collapsed, their bodies liquefying from the inside, turning to molten sludge that sprayed from their mouths and eye sockets. A towering Carnifex's head exploded outward, a fountain of steaming grey matter and bone fragments bursting from every seam in its skull. For a breath, the swarm wavered. Then the spear kept going. The hive mind was not a single node. It was an ocean. The psychic lance bored through the Dominus and plunged into that sea. It did not kill. It could not. It was like stabbing a knife into the surface of a world ocean. It caused a splash, a wound that healed even as it was made. The backlash tore back along its path. In the basilica, Nairos's coven came apart. Psychers burst like overfilled sacks, their bodies exploding into sprays of blood and shredded meat that painted the cracked marble and dripping icons. Some simply fell, their minds extinguished, eyes rolling back into their skulls as they collapsed into heaps of slack meat. Others caught fire from the inside, jaws distending in impossible screams as warp flame poured out of their mouths and eye sockets, burning them to blackened statues where they stood. Nairos himself was slammed to his knees, his helm lenses shattered from within, green glass blowing outward in a shower of shards that cut ruts into the marble. Blood poured from beneath his helm, dripping in thick ropes onto the floor. He screamed, not in fear, but in furious frustration, fingers clawing at the air as his staff skittered away. When it ended, the basilica was a slaughter pen of charred corpses and twitching limbs. Nairos dragged himself upright, swaying, the inside of his skull feeling as if it had been scraped raw. His connection to the warp stuttered, then came back in broken pulses. He laughed, the sound bubbling. "Did I hurt you?" he whispered, though he knew the hive mind could not hear his words as words. "Did you feel that, monster?" Out on the plains, Varak stood atop a wrecked tank hull, watching the Tyranids begin to move again, like a tide resuming after a brief, surprised retreat. He had seen the momentary collapse, smelled opportunity, and then watched it flow away. Even now, gaunt bodies that had been reduced to slurry were being drawn toward feeder pools. Feeder, organisms dragged chunks of carnifex into pits that pulsed hungrily, organs already disassembling the meat into useful components. Where demon engines had fallen, their armor and bound flesh were reduced to scrap for bioassimilation. Every warrior he sent to die, mortal or Astartes, every demon he called, every tank and gun and promethium cache, it all went to the same place once it broke. The swarm did not waste. It did not honor enemies. It made them food. He realized with a cold, rising understanding the strategic horror of it. There was no attrition for the Tyranids, in any sense that mattered. There was only conversion. Killed beasts became fresh biomass. Lost flesh returned as new muscle and claw. Even the warp-cursed bodies of plague marines and demon engines were being studied, tasted, folded into new forms. The war did not diminish the devourer, it fattened it. "The more we give it," he muttered, words for himself alone, "the stronger it becomes." He looked around at the field where world eaters still roared amid piles of corpses, where plague marines coughed spores and laughed wetly, where raptors and gargoyles fell from the sky locked together, and he saw not a battlefield, but a banquet hall. The hive mind watched through 1,000 pairs of eyes as its schemes played out. It had noted the resilience of Astartes' flesh, the way ceramite armor shrugged lesser blows, the strange persistence of warp, untouched physiology, resisting poisons that would have felled entire regiments of baseline humans. It had watched as chain blades and lightning claws sheared through chitin with contemptuous ease. The next waves crawling down from the bioships were different. Gaunts dropped into the muck on reinforced limbs, their talons tipped with a resin that glistened with acidic slime. Where they struck ceramite, it hissed, bubbling, the toughened plates softening and sloughing away in strings of liquefied armor. Bone drills extended from new, organisms' forelimbs, their tips whirring, perfectly sized to jam into the joint gaps of power, armor gorgets and knee couplings. Venom sacs pulsed along throats and bellies, glands tuned by Norn Queen instinct to exude toxins that reacted violently with warped flesh. When a new breed's spines strayed beneath the skin of a Chaos Marine, they did not simply poison. They burned with eldritch fire, disrupting the unnatural cohesion of mutated organs, making hearts forget to beat, lungs forget to breathe. The hive mind adjusted. The devourer learned. Every act of defiance, every blow struck in the name of gods that feasted on souls, was measured, weighed, and filed away as data. Zarakthos bled, and the things that ate it grew sharper teeth. Zarakthos had become a sick thing, a world wearing two different diseases. From orbit, the Shrine Forge no longer resembled a skull of light and industry. It was a patchwork carcass, its continent stitched with veins of living chitin and scabbed over with islands of warp scar tissue. There were regions where reality still clung to its old shapes, the outline of hive cities and manufactoria plains faintly visible beneath crawling growths. There were others where the laws of physics had been dragged into a corner and beaten until they screamed. Under demonic influence, whole districts had softened. Buildings slumped into obscene curves, stone and steel drooling like tallow left too near a fire. Faces bulged from walls, half-formed and wailing, mouths opening and closing without sound, as their stone tongues tried to remember words of prayer and found only gibbering. Streets wrinkled like scarred flesh. Rivers ran uphill, then sideways, then folded into themselves. The Tyranids answered that blasphemy with their own, colder corruption. Capillary forests erupted from the crust, towers of pulsing meat that clawed at the sky. They rose from shattered hab blocks and shrine plazas alike, spines bristling with sensory. Nodules. Their roots ran deep, a web of organic pipes that drilled down through hive foundations and manufactoria vaults. Where they grew thickest, the very ground throbbed, each pulse in time with the distant beat of Norn Queen hearts. Bioterraforming spread like a rash across the planetary crust. Plains that had once been ash-grey manufactoria belts were now carpets of nodular growths that popped and oozed nutrient ichor. Mountains were chewed down into sloping mounds of churned rock and bone, their peaks broken and crowned with spore chimneys that hurled clouds of microscopic death into the already diseased air. Oceans, once black with refinery scum, were now clogged with mats of feeder tendrils and corpse scum. The bodies of the billions already claimed floated in dense rafts, stripped down to pale, bloated meat that bobbed gently in rhythm with the feeding currents beneath. Entire hive cities were reduced to skeletal spires, their lower levels chewed away, their upper tiers wrapped tight in sinew and fleshy creepers. Demonic faces pushed out from beneath the chitin that swaddled them, eyes bulging, teeth gnashing as they tried to bite through the encasing Tyranid growth. In places, the warp scars and the capillary forests intersected, demon flesh and alien meat oozing into one another, warping into hybrids that the universe itself seemed reluctant to acknowledge. The planet screamed. It screamed in the warp, in the machine code shrieks of tormented cogitators, in the dying outrage of saints whose bones had been fed to bioreactors. It screamed in the chittering psychic haze of the hive mind, and in the mad laughter of demons who gnawed at its fraying soul. From a wider lens, Zarakthos was simply one more point of turbulence in a galaxy built on atrocity. From within, it was an endless howl. The Zarakthos Dominus stood at the center of that howl and conducted it. The Hive Tyrant had become more than a battlefield commander. It was the primary, synaptic anchor for the entire planetary swarm, a luminous knot in the network of alien thought that drifted through the atmosphere like invisible static. From its position atop a captured hive crown, its triple-crested skull rising against a sky bruised by warp storm and spore clouds, it surveyed its prey. Below, Varax's primary stronghold hunched like a wound that refused to close. The fortress cathedral had been a fusion of shrine and manufactorum, even before the invasion, a mountain of adamantium and reinforced rockcrete laced with forge stacks and reliquary towers. The Black Legion had thickened its walls with captured armor, turned promenades into kill galleries, and studded every surface with gun emplacements. It was a blunt statement of refusal, a black tooth driven into the world's bleeding gum. The Dominus extended its will. Capillary towers erupted around the fortress in a tightening circle. They punched up from the ground with explosive force, showering trenches, and bunkers with dirt, shattered stone, and pieces of men who had been too close. Their upper tips unfurled into fronded antennae that flexed and twitched, funneling data and biomass both back to the waiting bioships above. Living cables rose from the towers, twining together to form thicker cords that reached toward orbit. They pulsed, a slow, obscene pumping motion as atmosphere was drawn upward, stripped of useful gases, and returned in altered form. The hive fleet settled into feeding posture, like a cluster of leeches finding the best angle on a swollen vein. The world's own air was being drunk. Inside the fortress cathedral, alarms rang and vox nets filled with static and hatred.
Please support the channel, like, comment, subscribe. I would highly appreciate it. And let's get back into it.
Varax gathered what remained of his scattered warbands and mortal hosts with the same brutal strength he brought to personal combat. Orders went out over blood-slick vox consoles, carried on frequencies that crackled with interference. Summoners bellowed, their words wrapped around crude amplifiers that broadcast their calls across the cratered plains. They came to him, world eaters, armor still dripping with the ichor of 100 slain, clanked through the gates in packs, howling praise to Khorne. Black Legion squads, scarred and diminished, fell in around their lord, bolters freshly loaded, chainswords re-oiled with whatever blood was nearest. Cultists swarmed in their wake, a tide of rags and stolen armor, eyes bright with fanaticism or empty with shock. Traitor guardsmen marched in ragged columns, officers whipping them forward, banners flapping, tattered and stained, still bearing the imperial aquila defaced with 8-pointed stars. Varax walked their mustering lines like a priest among his congregation. He spoke through helmet vox and the raw force of his presence. "You have seen this world bleed," he told them. "You have drunk from its veins. You have hung its saints in chains from their own altars. Now something comes to take that feast from us. A beast with no faith, no rage, no understanding of glory. It does not care for your oaths or your sins. It only eats." He raised his chain axe, the teeth revving, still crusted with Tyranid gore. "Will you let it?" A roar answered him. Clanging weapons, screamed blasphemies, sobbed prayers turned inside out. "I promise you skulls beyond counting," Varax snarled. "Offerings enough to drown the throne. I promise you that those who die will die with their blades in the guts of a god-eater. And those who live..." He laughed, the sound slicing through vox silence and open air both. "Those who live will have walked through the maw of a nightmare and come out the other side still laughing. What god would dare deny such a soul?" Engines ground to life across the stronghold. Tanks coughed smoke and flame. Demon engines stirred in their pens, brass and iron limbs flexing, bound spirits howling for release. The fortress vomited warbands and armor in a dark tide, pouring from its gates in all directions, converging on a single point of slaughter. The Valley of Hollow Saints had waited centuries for this battle. It lay to the west of the fortress, a natural fold in the crust that the ecclesiarchy had carved and reshaped into a place of pilgrimage. Mountains had been cut into colossal statues, their flanks chiseled into the likenesses of saints and heroes, each figure towering over the valley floor. Pilgrims had once walked beneath those stone gazes, feeling the weight of piety in every carved line. Now, the valley was a killing ground. The first shots had shattered many of those stone faces. Bioplasma blasts and macro shell impacts had blown features away, leaving eyeless pits and broken teeth. World Eaters clambered over shattered saintly fingers and along crumbling noses to gain vantage points, chain axes revving. Tyranid growths wrapped the lower slopes, sinew and chitin gripping carved robes, pulling them down inch by inch. As Varax's combined host poured into the valley, the swarm rose to meet them. Tyranid warriors advanced in lines, their heavy builds bristling with bone blades and strangling weapons. Behind them surged broods of gaunts, their claws scrabbling for purchase on blood-slick stone. Carnifexes lumbered between toppled statues, each thunderous step cracking the ground further, rubble sliding in fans around their massive feet. The collision was cataclysmic. Chaos tanks ground forward, treads crushing gaunts under their bulk, bolter sponsons spitting fire into the oncoming mass. Tyranid artillery beasts hurled globs of seething bioplasm that splashed across armor, eating through steel and flesh alike. A defiled Sanctus tank, once a reliquary transport, now repurposed into a siege breaker, took a direct hit. Its hull glowed cherry red, then burst. The relics within vaporized along with the crew. World Eaters clambered over heaps of Tyranid corpses, using the dead as ramps to launch themselves into new knots of combat. One berserker planted his boots on the broken brow of a toppled saint, leaping from there onto the back of a passing carnifex. He drove both axes into its spine, carving until he cut through to the beast's chest, riding it down in a fountain of spinal fluid and gore. Terminators of the Black Legion formed the core of the assault line, massive suits of tactical dreadnought armor wading through fire like walking bunkers. Their combi bolters and Reaper autocannons chewed through gaunts, piles of corpses piling at their feet. They strode forward inexorably, each step a statement of contempt. Tyranid warriors met them. A warrior, its bone sword crackling with bioelectric energy, lunged. The blade punched through a Terminator's breastplate, sliding between ceramite plates to rupture both hearts. The massive warrior convulsed. The Tyranid wrenched its sword upward, splitting armor and ribcage alike, and hoisted the upper half of the Astartes into the air. He hung there, twitching, entrails dangling like ropes, before the warrior flung him aside into the waiting jaws of a Ripper swarm. Statues toppled under the strain. A mountain carved into the likeness of a crusading confessor finally gave way as Tyranid tunnelers undermined its base. The entire peak groaned, then collapsed, a slow-motion avalanche of stone saintly flesh. It crashed down onto both sides' formations without care, crushing tanks, berserkers, warriors, and carnifexes alike into a uniform gruel of bone, rock, and twisted metal. Through it all, the Zarakthos Dominus watched. The Hive Tyrant's perception encompassed the valley, the fortress, and beyond. It saw lines of attack as glowing threads, saw points of weakness as black knots waiting to be cut. It felt the weight of the capillary towers pulsing around the fortress, connecting land to sky, forming a tightening noose. Inside that noose, another kind of blade was being forged. Within the fortress, cathedral beneath stone that shook with every distant impact, Nyros prepared his last great gamble. He stood in a chamber that had once held the planet's holiest relics. Now it held caged machine spirits and agony. Rows of servitors were wired into banks of cogitators, their eyes wide and unblinking, mouths stretched into silent screams, as Scaril 9's reconfigured noosphere poured raw data and pain through their brains. The air was hot with burnt circuitry and the copper tang of blood. The sorcerer's earlier attempt to summon a demon prince had almost broken him. He had felt the hive mind's cold vastness and the crushing pressure of the shadow. He had watched his coven die in splashes of blood and black flame. What remained of his sanity clung to the idea of precision, where brute force had failed. Not a prince, not a throne, a blade. He knelt before a ritual circle, etched not in blood, but in code and pain. The floor beneath him had been carved into complex fractals of sigils and numerological sequences, their channels filled with liquid metal that glowed with stolen reactor heat. Around the circle, the tortured spirits of the Manufactoria whispered through vox speakers and noospheric projectors, their binary shrieks woven into a continuous chorus. He reached into the world's screaming noosphere and took hold. Every last shriek from a dying assembly line, every panicked vox burst from a collapsing hab block, every machine spirit's protest as Tyranid growths invaded its sanctum. He dragged them close, compressing them into a single vibrating line of meaning. The blade he envisioned was not metal. It was an edge of concept, a line of cancellation. If he could drive it between the Dominus and the mind above, he might sever the tyrant's connection, cast it adrift, blind a significant portion of the swarm. The warp storm outside rumbled, its tides affected by the same signal that drew the Tyranids. The shadow pressed in. Nyros was attempting to cut a thread in the dark while standing in a storm of claws. He began the incantation. At first, it worked. Power coalesced in the circle, unnatural light pooling like oil. The liquid metal in the channels rose in thin sheets, folding into a plane that curved around an absence, a line so sharp it seemed to slice the sight of it. Stray demons lurking at the edges of the ritual recoiled, keening, as if even they feared the concept taking shape. Then the warp storm and the shadow collided. Outside, in the roiling heavens, a curtain of unreality slammed against the suffocating mass of the hive mind's presence. Warp lightning, which had been lancing in wild arcs, suddenly bent, dragged along invisible lines of alien thought. The storm tried to express itself. The shadow tried to deny that expression. The result was not silence, but a discordant scream. That scream reverberated down into the ritual chamber. The precise edge of the forming warp blade shuddered, its clean geometry fractured. Instead of one straight, merciless curve, it splintered into a dozen jagged lines. They twisted, buckled, and then melted. Demons began to ooze from the circle. They came as lumps of malign possibility, dripping from the edges of the failed blade like fat from a roasting corpse. They hit the floor and bounced, then unfolded into shapes that strained even the generous definition of monstrosity. Limbs sprouted in wrong places, and then dove back into the torso. Faces bloomed like ulcers along their flanks, eyes rolling, mouths opening without sound. They screamed anyway. The sound existed only in the warp, but its echo shook the mortal chamber. The walls cracked, servitors spasmed, their brains boiling in their skulls. A witch who had survived the earlier backlash took one look at the malformed things and his heart burst in his chest, blood geysering from his mouth and nose as he toppled. The demons lashed out blindly. One flailed tendrils of what looked like glass fiber, shredding the air itself into ribbons that smoked and twisted. A traitor guard officer, too slow to move, was cut into neat, sliding slabs, armor, flesh, bone, and all. Another spawned a forest of barbed chains from its underside, whipping them in every direction, flensing skin from cultists and carving plates from Astartes' armor. Nyros staggered back, cloak whipping in the backwash. This was not the surgical strike he had intended. This was a tumor given legs and teeth. Above, the Zarakthos Dominus had no time for the subtleties of warp failure. It led a spearhead straight at the fortress. The capillary towers that had grown around the stronghold now served as guides. Broods swarmed along their bases, turning the ring of organic columns into a living wheel of chitin and flesh. At the Dominus's command, a tide of tyrant guard and monstrous creatures surged toward the fortress's outer defenses. The first wave died in droves, gun lines that had been silent too. Bait, the swarm erupted, spitting las fire, heavy bolter shells, and auto-cannon rounds. Gaunts disintegrated by the hundreds, their bodies shredded into sprays of flesh mist and spinning fragments. Tyrant guards took the hits on plates of thickened chitin, chunks blowing out of their armor, limbs severed. They ran on, uncaring, until their bodies simply failed from accumulated damage. The Dominus advanced behind them, synaptic halo crackling. Gaunts threw themselves into kill zones knowingly. They piled up in mounds, their corpses forming berms that broke lines of fire. Larger beasts used those fleshy ramparts as cover, hunkering behind them as they spat more bioplasma or launched living projectiles. The defenses were choked with chitin and bodies until the difference between trench and no man's land became academic. Demons from Nairos's failed ritual boiled out into those same defenses, slamming into the oncoming Tyranids and Chaos forces with equal enthusiasm. They ripped Gaunts in half, then turned and tore into cultists. They chewed on Tyrant Guard carapace, then swung malformed limbs into the faceplates of black legionaries. Screams and ichor of every color blended into a single, overwhelming stench of annihilation. Into that maelstrom strode Varax. He met the Zarakthos Dominus amid a shattered Manufactorum cathedral that had once raised tanks and shells in the Emperor's name. Now, its roof gone, its apses blown out, it served as the arena for two apex predators. The floor was a churned mess of rubble and flesh, tank hulls half melted into sagging sculptures, saint statues collapsed into piles of stone limbs. Smoke and spore fog hung in the air, lit by the flicker of distant fires. The Dominus stepped through a broken arch, towering above a phalanx of tyrant guard that died in a storm of bolter and las fire to clear its path. Varax walked out from the opposite side, alone. His armor was cracked and scorched, symbols of gold blackened with ash and acid. One horn of his helm had been snapped off. His chain axe still whirred, though several teeth were missing, leaving jagged gaps in its circle. His power fist glowed crimson, bleeding small arcs of energy between its fingers. They regarded one another without words. Then they charged. The Dominus's bone saber swept down in a killing arc, the blade leaving a comet trail of bioelectric discharge. Varax threw himself forward, meeting the blow with his chain axe. Teeth shrieked as they bit into the organic weapon, sparks and ichor spraying as the two energies clashed. The force of the impact rattled the Manufactorum's remaining supports, sending dust and fragments raining from high galleries. Varax twisted, letting the saber slide along his axe's teeth, stepping in close. He drove his power fist into the tyrant's chest. The blow landed with the sound of a building collapsing, armor plates cracking inward, fleshy underlayers rupturing. A gout of thick, dark ichor exploded from the wound, splattering the floor in a fan. The Dominus roared, a psychic bellow that hammered at Varax's mind. For a moment, the Chaos Lord's vision whitened, his ears filled with the sound of his own blood boiling. He laughed into it, teeth gritted behind his helm. He swung his chain axe again. The tyrant moved with a speed that belied its size. It sidestepped, bone saber whipping around. The blade sheared through Varax's pauldron, slicing it away in a shower of ceramite fragments and flesh. It bit into the meat of his upper arm, cutting muscle and severing one of the nutrient tubes that fed his enhanced body. Black blood sprayed, hissing where it hit the alien weapon. Varax ignored the pain, driving forward under the tyrant's guard. He slammed his shoulder into its torso, his weight and momentum pushing it back a step. His axe came up, teeth whining, and sank into the creature's throat. The blade chewed through chitin, opening a ragged trench that spewed ichor and shards of bone. For a heartbeat, it seemed as though he might actually fell the beast. Then the hive mind reminded him that he was fighting more than a single enemy. Synaptic lightning exploded from the Dominus's crest, an arc of psycho-reactive force that slammed into Varax's helm. His vision went black, his muscles convulsed. He staggered, chain axe slipping free of the wound. The tyrant's bone whip snapped around, coiling about his waist. He roared, trying to tear free, power fist hammering at the ensnaring limb. The whip tightened, plates creaking as his torso was crushed. Ribs, already broken in earlier battles, snapped further, jagged ends piercing organs. He felt something inside him tear, hot fluid flooding his chest cavity. The Dominus drove him to the floor. Its talons pinned him, one punching through his thigh, nailing his leg to the cracked decking. Another speared his shoulder, impaling him through the joint. His armor buckled, spikes and trophies, snapping off, rattling away. He fought like an animal in a trap, swinging his axe one-handed, snarling devotions to Khorne. The blade cut gouges in the tyrant's limbs, sending more ichor raining down. The creature's breath washed over him, a stench of acid and wet meat. The Zarakthos Dominus lowered its head. Its maw opened, rows of jagged teeth unfolding. Lesser feeder tendrils quested from between them, tasting the air. Then, slowly, with dreadful inevitability, it took hold of Varax's arm at the elbow, just below the power fist. It bit down. Ceramite cracked, then popped, armor peeling like too thin shell. Flesh tore, bones snapped. Varax's howl blasted over the voxnet, an inhuman bellow that made mortals miles away flinch without knowing why. Blood geysered, splashing across the tyrant's face, running in rivulets down its armor. It chewed, swallowed, moved to the next limb. One by one, his arms and legs were torn from his body, fed into the Dominus's, drooling more. It savored each piece with mechanical focus, crunching enhanced bone, grinding gene-crafted muscle between its teeth. Each bite sent fresh waves of agonized rage and ecstasy through Varax's failing nervous system. Pinned to the floor by its talons, his torso a mangled stump, Varax laughed. He laughed through blood and bile, choking on his own ruined lungs, because he would not give the beast the satisfaction of hearing him beg. He spat curses in a dozen dead dialects, invoked the names of demons, hurled blasphemies at a sky that was mostly chitin and fire. When the tyrant's final bite closed around his helm and tore his head from his neck, his soul did not go quietly. It tore free in a gout of psychic noise, a death scream made of 10,000 years of hatred and killing. It lanced out into the warp, a jagged spike of rage and defiance that ripped for a heartbeat through the smothering shadow. For that instant, the hive mind's pressure parted around it like fog around a shell blast. Nyros felt it. In the chaos of his failed ritual, surrounded by malformed demons and dying followers, the sorcerer straightened, as if a chain had been jerked through his spine. Varax's final scream cut through the static in his thoughts, burned a clear line through the storm. For one crystalline moment, he saw. He saw Zarakthos as the hive fleet saw it, a map of biomass, glowing nodes of resistance like embers in a sea of fuel. He saw the capillary towers thickening, the bioships settling, the planetary crust being chewed and remade. He saw the demon taints as interesting anomalies, to be sampled and understood, not feared. He saw the timeline of the world's remaining life, measured not in years or even months, but in feeding cycles. He saw that every act of defiance, every summoning, every counterattack had been no more than spice on the meat. When the vision snapped, it left him on his knees, gasping, hands clawing at the floor. The planet still screamed. Now, at last, Nyros understood that it was not a cry for help. It was the gurgle of a throat filling with blood as teeth closed around it. Varax died screaming, and his death scream went on long after his throat was gone. It rippled through the warp and across vox bands, a howl of rage and refusal that made mortals drop their weapons and clutch at their ears, and made Astartes pause for the span of a heartbeat in mid-slaughter. Then it cut off, swallowed by the Devourer's maw, and in the silence that followed, Zarakthos felt very small. Word of the Black Lord's death spread through the ruined warbands, like fire in a Prometheum spill. Some refused to believe it, snarling that no beast could kill a veteran of the Long War. Others took it as proof that the gods had withdrawn their favor and turned their guns on their neighbors rather than the Xenos. Skirmishes flared in trenches and hab corridors between warbands that had stood shoulder to shoulder moments before, bolter fire and chain blades settling grudges too long ignored. More than one Chaos champion tried to seize command by simple declaration, bellowing that Khorne or Nurgle or the Dark Gods in Tyre had chosen them as the new fist of this slaughter. Most died mid-sentence as snipers, demons, or Tyranid bioweapons punched through their chests or ripped their heads off. The Chaos front fractured. Lines that had been merely ragged became a lacework of isolated pockets, islands of defiance in a sea of chitin and teeth. Yet very few ran. Blood oaths bound them. Hatred held them. These were not foes who understood retreat as the Imperium did, as a tactical necessity. To most of them, the idea of fleeing this feast, this once-in-an-aeon opportunity to die drowning in the gore of a world, was blasphemy. They fell back, but they fell back toward the shrine fortress. Columns of wounded Astartes limped and stumbled through streets lined with Tyranid growths, blasting and hacking there, way past peripheral broods. Cultists marched beside them, some chanting, some weeping, some glass-eyed and silent. Traitor guardsmen dragged artillery pieces by hand where engines had failed, boots slipping in the mess of ichor and blood. Behind them, the swarm pressed, never tiring, never rushing, just walking forward with that same patient, devouring intent. The fortress cathedral's guns spoke in welcome and defiance, covering their approach. Cannons that had once saluted Imperial fleet visits now tore ragged chunks from the oncoming tide, painting the shattered approaches with showers of alien meat. By the time the last of Varax's host had slammed the outer gates shut, Zarakthos had no more room for conventional hope. Nyros stood on a balcony overlooking the fortress's inner courtyard and watched the remnants of his master's army crawling into their final hole. He watched as wounded were triaged with the sharp efficiency of those who knew that there would be no medici, no recovery, no long convalescence. A man either stood to fight or was hauled away to serve as meat or sacrifice. His helm was gone, vaporized in the feedback of his last failed ritual. His face was a ruin of burns and dried blood, eyes twin pits of warp light. Lines of black script had been carved into his scalp and cheeks, fresh scars weeping thin threads of crimson that smoked in the chill air. He smiled without humor. "Very well," he whispered, voice raw. "If we cannot own this feast, we can at least poison the table." The idea that took shape in his mind was not new. Others had tried it on other worlds. Some had succeeded. Some had merely given the gods a momentary flare of amusement. Bind the reactors, bind the forges, bind the beating hearts of the planet's industry into a single pulse. Turn Zarakthos into a bomb and a beacon, a demon world birthed in one incandescent act of blasphemy. Or failing that, deny the devourer its due. He turned, cloak, whispering over cracked stone, and descended into the fortress's depths. Scaril 9 awaited him in the machine catacombs. The tech had sunk further into his own madness. Where once he had a recognizable human torso, now even that was suspect. flesh and metal braided together in his upper frame, ribs replaced with brass cages holding still-beating hearts wired to cogitators. His legs were a nest of mechadendrites and tract units, dozens of limbs carrying him from console to console, in a dance only he understood. The chamber they occupied was vast, its walls studded with reactor control thrones and data looms salvaged from across the planet. Thick cables ran from them in all directions, disappearing into the rock, connecting to the macro-reactors buried beneath forge hives, to the primary plasma cores under the shrine spires, to the deep-buried magma taps that had once kept the Manufactoria running. A hololithic display of Zarakthos' crust hung overhead, a ghostly globe marked with veins of light. "You can do it," Nyros said, without preamble. Scaril 9's remaining eye lens flickered as he considered the statement. Binary murmurs spilled from his Vox grill, a stream of machine cant that translated roughly to annoyance, piety, and twisted pride. "It is already being done," he rasped. "The reactors pray, whether they wish to or not." He extended a dozen mechadendrites toward the globe, tapping points of light. "These are the macro-reactors," he said. "These the forge cores. These the plasma hearts. I speak to each. I tell them a new litany, inscribed by your hand. They answer. They weep. They obey." Nyros stared up at the globe. Orbit had already gouged sigils into the planet's flesh. Earlier chaos bombardments, meant to break defensive lines and hive crowns, had left craters and scars that, when viewed from a distance with the right madness, formed the strokes of a vast, crude rune. Scaril 9 had refined that. Brutality, directing subsequent fire to complete the lines, to carve a planetary sigil into the crust itself. Zarakthos had become a rune of its own destruction. "Bring all of it here," Nyros said. "Every erg of spare output, every pressure vault, every forge core that still beats. We will bind them to one moment and one phrase." Scaril 9 hesitated. "There is a significant probability," he said, "that doing so will rupture the crust entirely, turning the mantle upon itself. The continent-scale damage will—" He trailed off. Both of them knew the end of that calculation. "Do it," Nyros said softly. "We are beyond concern for fault lines." The heretic nodded and extended his limbs fully. Mechadendrites plunged into reactor cores, their tips glowing as they bored through insulation and shielding. Other tendrils sank into data looms, jacking directly into their logic stacks. Scaril 9's body shook as staggering amounts of power and information began to flow through him. Lights flickered all across the chamber. The hololithic globe brightened, veins of light lancing between points as more and more systems were drawn into a single schema. Across Zarakthos, machine spirits whimpered. Reactors that had been running hot for months felt their controls overridden, safety locks stripped away by invasive codes that tasted of oil and blood. Forge cores that had never known rest found their output demanded, then demanded again, until their housings groaned and hairline fractures spidered across containment walls. The ritual geometry began to lock. The warp felt it. So did the Devourer. High above, within the choking embrace of the warp storm and the shadow in the warp, the hive mind identified a new anomaly blooming at the planet's heart. It felt the gathering of energy, the tension in the crust, the way the screaming of machine spirits and tormented souls tilted toward a new sharp edge. It did not understand the details of ritual or summoning. It did not need to. It knew threat. It knew when prey tried to sting. Through the Zarakthos Dominus, it reacted. The Dominus's synaptic halo flared. Across the scarred globe, broods paused, adjusted their vectors, and turned. Biotitans that had been reducing hive spires to rubble pivoted ponderously and began to march toward the shrine fortress. Tunneler beasts that had been chewing their own invasion paths toward scattered pockets of resistance altered course, diving deeper to merge their burrows into one massive network aimed at the fortress's foundations. From every horizon, the swarm converged. Seen from the crumbling walls, it resembled a storm front of flesh. Waves of gaunts and warriors flowed over ridges and through collapsed avenues, their bodies a shifting carpet. Above them, clouds of gargoyles and other winged monsters blotted out the sky, their shadows turning the fortress into a bowl of dusk. Behind them, looming shapes marked the approach of biotitans, their towering silhouettes occasionally lit by the flash of distant biocannon discharge. Inside the fortress, preparations for the last heresy continued. The great central nave had been transformed into a killing floor and an altar both. The last herds of human life had been driven there. Cultists who had prayed for this chance, enslaved citizens who had once believed in imperial salvation, workers who had only ever known the inside of Manufactoria. They filled the floor from wall to wall, a sea of faces twisted by terror, fervor, or numb acceptance. Chaos Marines moved through them like reapers. Black legionaries and allied warbands walked in ordered lines, bolters leveled, chain blades ready. At Nyros's command, this was not to be a chaotic massacre, but a controlled torrent. Rivers of blood required channels. The first rank of victims was forced to its knees at the edge of a deep pit carved into the nave's floor, its sides lined with rune-marked metal. One by one, the Astartes placed muzzles against the backs of bowed heads and fired. Skulls burst, brains splashed, bodies toppled forward into the pit in twitching heaps, the fall snapping remaining necks and shattering bones. Blood cascaded after them, turning the sides of the shaft slick and dark. As the first layer of corpses piled, the next rank was pushed forward to take their place. The pits multiplied. What had once been radiating chapels were gutted and repurposed into gore catchments, their floors stripped and deepened. Channels cut into the stone connected them to a central reservoir beneath the altar, not of holy water, but of liquefied flesh and life. As more people died, their bodies thrown in, their fluids pumped and scraped from stone, those channels became tributaries, feeding a growing lake of offerings. Billions had lived on Zarakthos. Now, in the fortress, the last billions died in ordered butchery. The roar of the firing squads, the endless thunder of bolt shells, the shrieks and sobs and prayers became a steady background hum, like the heartbeat of a god too big to see. Nyros stood at the altar above that lake and breathed it in, feeling each death as a pinprick in the warp, each spurting artery another thin thread to weave into his final spell. Below, the enemy began to bite through the floor. The first tunneler megabeast announced its arrival with a shudder that knocked icons from walls. The stone of a side sanctum bulged, then exploded inward in a hail of pulverized rock and broken iron. A vast, circular maw punched through, ringed with spiraling teeth, its diameter wide enough to swallow a tank. The beast shook itself free of the debris, chitin ridges scraping the walls, and emitted a deep, wet roar. Gaunts poured from behind it, swarming through the breach into the lower corridors. They met desperate defenders in passageways too tight for proper firing lines. Cultists with rusty blades died in the first heartbeat, bodies shredded into paste as the creatures ran over them. Traitor guardsmen fired point blank, las bolts burning holes in carapace, before being buried under a living avalanche, their own guts smeared along the walls. A Black Legion squad made a stand at a junction, bolters on full auto, chainswords snarling until the floor beneath them collapsed as another tunneler erupted from below, reducing the entire intersection to a collapsing shaft full of tumbling bodies and snapping teeth. Tunneler after tunneler broke through. The fortress's lower sanctums became a labyrinth of breached bulkheads and heaving earth. Gaunts and larger beasts swarmed upward through the ruined foundations, following scent trails of blood and psychic markers toward the densest concentrations of life. They gorged themselves in the corridors, then moved on, leaving only rags of flesh and spent casings behind. Every second they bought Nyros was paid for in skulls. In the ritual chamber, the sorcerer had no attention to spare for the butcher's work outside. His entire consciousness was bent toward a single, insane task. He was trying to speak to a god. The ritual circuitry that Scaril 9 had woven flickered around him, a halo of holographic equations and blood-smeared sigils. The reactor's rumbling was a constant vibration in his bones, the growing pressure in the cores a slow climb toward catastrophe. Warp energy coiled in the chamber like a trapped storm, slamming against the walls, trying to vent itself into the path of least resistance. Nyros wanted it to vent itself directly into the hive mind's face. He extended his thoughts, not upward into the traditional vastness of the immaterium, but sideways, toward the cold, implacable pressure he had felt before. He followed the psychic cables that connected the Zarakthos Dominus to the broods, and the broods to the wider ocean beyond. He traced those lines back, step by step, into the dark. For a brief instant, he succeeded. His mind brushed Charybdis. Language failed. There were no words in any human tongue to describe the sensation. He did not see or hear. He experienced concepts of tasting and mapping, of endless, tireless cataloging. He felt himself recognized not as an individual, but as an input. His entire life, centuries of war and treachery and devotion, compressed into a handful of data points. Nutrient value, genetic interest, psychic threat assessment, recycling potential. He felt the Tyranids estimate the energy yield of burning his body, the likely advantages of integrating his mutational quirks into new warrior castes, the statistical impact his death would have on the morale of the meat around him. He tried to hurl curses into that vastness. They registered as signal noise, interesting only insofar as they revealed a particular pattern of synapse interference. He realized, in that moment, the full extent of his insignificance. More importantly, he realized what his ritual would actually do. It would not corrupt the devourer. There was nothing there to corrupt, no ego to seduce, no sense of self to tempt. The warp detonation would roll through the swarm, burning billions of organisms to ash, boiling seas of biomass, tearing synapse threads asunder. And then the hive fleet would eat the ash. The biomass lost would, in time, be replenished from other worlds. The psychic shock, the sudden loss of so many nodes and bodies, would be recorded, integrated, turned into lessons learned. The next time the hive mind encountered such an attempt, it would be more ready. At best, his grand working would be a bright scar on an endless thing. A day of pain and surprise, a story to be told in fluctuations of thought. He broke contact, gasping, stumbling, bile splattering from his mouth. For a heartbeat, the vast awareness tugged at him, curious, tasting his retreat, wondering if pulling him back for dissection would yield useful data. Then the immediate demands of planetary consumption tugged it elsewhere, and he was left alone in his skull again. He wiped his mouth with the back of his gauntlet, smearing acid-tinged vomit across burned flesh. "It learns," he whispered. "It always learns." The rational choice would have been to shut the ritual down, to let Zarakthos die in the slow, inevitable way the swarm had planned, to allow his own hatred to fade into the static background of a galaxy without him. Nyros was not a rational man. If it must learn, he said, to no one and everyone, then let it learn to fear our spite. He reached out and took hold of the ritual's core. Scaril 9 screamed as the reactors hit their tipping point. His mechadendrites caught fire along their lengths, sparks crawling over his limbs as containment fields failed. Plasma cores across the planet surged into overload, their carefully maintained balances tumbling into the red. Forge hearts that had beaten steady for longer than any living thing could. Remember now raced toward rupture. Nyros spoke the final word. Zarakthos tore itself open. For a few agonizing minutes, reality unraveled. From orbit, the planet seemed to swell. Its crust bulged, ripples of molten rock and twisted matter racing across its surface like the shock waves from a stone thrown into a pond. Light erupted from fracture lines, not the dull orange of magma, but a wild, flickering palette of warp colors that hurt the eyes to look upon. Capillary towers exploded as the shock tore through them, their fleshy columns bursting in fountains of gore and bioluminescent ruin. Bioships in low orbit shuddered as the lines connecting them to the planet convulsed, some having their tendrils simply ripped away, others yanked down toward the surface like beasts on chains shoved into a fire. On the ground, continents folded, hives imploded as their foundations liquefied, whole cities collapsing inward, spires toppling like rotten teeth into maws of fire. Tyranid forests, burned in impossible hues, trees of meat and chitin writhing as they were both incinerated and turned inside out, their inner structures briefly visible as labyrinths of hunger and function before becoming a spray of motes. Demons burst forth from every warp scar and summoning circle, shrieking, their forms inflated by the sudden surge of unsheathed power. Tyranid beasts screamed their own alien cries as the ground fell away beneath them, as their bodies warped under the pressure of unreality. Some fused together, a carnifex and a defiler merging into a single thrashing monstrosity of bone, brass, and claw that survived for exactly 3 heartbeats before a new tear in physics swallowed it whole. In the fortress cathedral, the lake of blood and meat that had been the sacrificial nexus rose in a single enormous wave, and inverted, a column of red that punched through the roof and into the sky, becoming a spine of frozen gore that then shattered into a storm of razors. In the warp, Zarakthos flared as a new raw wound. For those few minutes, it was a diamond world in truth, a place where the laws of cause and effect were rewritten in screams. Time stuttered, looping back on itself in pockets, trapping dying men in endless cycles of dismemberment. Space curled, corridors connecting directly to places they had no business reaching, allowing a single step to carry a warrior from the deepest sanctum to the foot of a collapsing mountain and back again in an eye blink. Daimons and Tyranids annihilated one another in patterns that made no sense to mortal minds. Warp-born blades sliced through chitin and thought both, while bioweapons, adapted in 1,000 ways, tore into forms that had never been meant to exist in any sane reality. Each kill fed both sides for a moment, until the momentum of the ritual took that sustenance back to itself. Then the surge collapsed. The warp storm snapped shut like a throttled throat. The nascent demon world, never fully stabilized, imploded under the weight of the immaterium's own shifting tides. Demons were yanked screaming back into the sea of madness, their flesh and borrowed time evaporating like mist under a harsh sun. The cracks in reality sealed most of them, leaving behind only scars and ghosts and shapes that did not quite match the angles they should. Zarakthos was left smaller, cracked, and burned. Almost all of the chaos forces still on its surface were gone, pulverized by collapsing structures, vaporized in plasma detonations, or simply erased by the warp's fleeting whim. Armor lay crushed into the rock, skulls embedded in molten glassy flows. A few pockets of survivors remained, huddled in shielded vaults or buried beneath rubble, but they were no longer an army. They were vermin. The Hive fleet had not escaped unscathed. Several bioships now hung ruined in orbit, their hulls ruptured, their innards venting in slow streams of frozen tissue. Living torpedoes, caught mid-launch when the surge hit, had fused together into ugly knots of flesh and teeth that drifted away into the dark, useless. The psychic backlash had burnt out nodes along Charybdis's synapse network, leaving sections of the swarm momentarily directionless, their bodies twitching mindlessly until new orders came. But the fleet still clung to the planet, those tendrils that had not been severed dug in, capillary towers that had survived the worst of the blast, began to grow anew. Their snapped stumps budding fresh nodes. New feeder organs blossomed along their sides, dripping with enzymes tuned to break down glacified rock and warped metal. Above the world wound that had been Zarakthos, chitinous silhouettes still shifted. The devourer had been burned, wounded, and surprised. It had lost a portion of its feast and gained a jagged, unpleasant memory. It adjusted, as it always did, and already, as the last echoes of the demon's scream faded, the planet's thin remaining atmosphere trembled to the slow, inexorable pull of alien lungs drawing in for another, deeper breath. Time passed on Zarakthos, but no one marked it. The world that had once burned like a votive in the darkness of the segmentum now hung shrunken and black, stripped of its veil of air. Where clouds had once trailed their shadows over hive crowns and manufactoria plains, there was only the bare, abraded flesh of the planet, wrapped in a net of Tyranid growths. Oceans were gone. The basins that had held them were now fields of digestion pools, crater lakes of slopping chemical broth. Feeder tendrils writhed at their surfaces, dragging down the last unbroken shapes of cities and mountains, dissolving them into a uniform slurry. Once proud ranges of stone, carved into the likeness of saints and heroes, had been mulched into ridges of chitin and bone. The original contours lost beneath the crawling, layered plates of organic fortification. Capillary towers rose everywhere, tall as the dead hive. Spires they had replaced. They pulsed with slow, obscene regularity, drawing what remained of Zarakthos' innards upward in great cyclic breaths. Deep beneath the surface, the mantle boiled where reactor detonation and warp scour had cracked the crust. The swarm's digestion conduits sipped at that heat, using it to fuel further processing. Nothing was wasted. Nothing resisted that could resist for long. In the hollow places, under what had once been hives, something like war still stumbled on. The survivors of Varax's host were not an army any longer. They were packs and nests, feral warbands, and cannibal cults hiding in the bones of the world. In collapsing hive basements and slag-flooded transit tunnels, they gathered around broken icons, worshipping shards of 8-pointed stars and splintered skull trophies. They had no voxnets now, no chain of command. They had rituals and hunger and hatred that had outlived context. One pack might paint itself in dried ichor and call itself blessed by Nurgle, even as its members coughed up pieces of their own lungs from breathing Tyranid spore dust. Another might drape tatters of flayed skin over rusted armor and scream Khorne's name into the darkness, then skulk away from any real battle like scavengers, picking through the aftermath of minor skirmishes for flesh still warm enough to eat. They occasionally ambushed small Tyranid broods, not for tactical advantage, but for meat. A cluster of termagants picking through the remains of a collapsed shrine might find themselves suddenly engulfed in a hail of scrap fire and crude explosives. The first rank would be torn apart, bodies bursting into gobbets of meat. Chaos remnants would slam into the rest with rusted blades and scavenged chainswords, hacking until the last gaunt stopped twitching, then fall on the corpses with bare hands and teeth. They would crack carapaces and scoop out the steaming organs, ignoring the burns and the bitter aftertaste. They would drag carcasses back to their nests, where half-starved children and warriors both gnawed on alien flesh by the light of impromptu corpse candles. Each such victory was a tiny, pointless defiance, an infection of will thrown at an immune system of pure, predatory logic. The swarm noticed them only when they grew too noisy. On a broken plateau of fused glass and bone that had once been part of a hive's upper habs, a Chaos champion made his last statement. He had no name anymore that anyone living remembered. His armor bore no heraldic devices beyond the 8-pointed star and the scars of too many wars. His helm had been split and discarded. His face was a ruin of burns, half the flesh melted down to glossy, scarred gristle. One eye was gone, the socket a black pit. The other burned with a mad, perfect clarity. He had spent weeks hauling corpses from the surrounding ruins to build his throne. It was a heap of skulls and twisted armor, a mound of bone and metal welded. Together with promethium and hate, human skulls with devotional verses still etched into their foreheads. Astartes' helms, split and scorched. Tyranid craniums, their elongated bones stripped of flesh, their eye sockets gouged. They made a spire of death that towered above the shattered plain. He stood atop it as the swarm closed in, chainsword in one hand, crackling power maul in the other. "Look!" he roared at the dead sky, voice raw, vox grill, long since torn away. "Do you see me, carrion gods? Do you hear me, you bloated liars? I have outlived your chosen. I have stood in the throat of a devourer, and I am still here." Gaunts flowed across the plain toward him, claws clicking on the glassy ground. Warriors strode among them, bone blades raised, synaptic pulses crackling along their spines. Above, gargoyles wheeled, waiting for the moment their prey was fully engaged before stooping. He spat at them. "Come then," he said. "Eat my flesh. You cannot eat my hate." He sprang down into their midst. His chainsword screamed, teeth chewing through carapace and flesh. His maul swung, arcs of energy bursting skulls and snapping spines. The first gaunts died in droves, hacked apart, their bodies flipping away, trailing brain matter and loops of intestine. He waded forward, each step spraying gore, his boots slipping on ruptured organs, his armor becoming a solid sheath of gore. They tore into him in return. Claws scraped along his warplate, some failing to find purchase, others biting into weakened joints. Bite marks blossomed across his greaves where gaunts latched on, teeth grinding against ceramite until they found a flaw. He ignored the pain, ignored the high keening of damaged nerves. He killed and killed and killed. Dozens fell, perhaps hundreds. In the end, it did not matter. The tide rose around him. Warriors closed, their bone swords parrying his maul, their lash whips catching his legs and arms, dragging him off balance. He hacked one, down, opening its chest in a spray of ichor, just as another stabbed a talon through his abdomen, pinning him to the side of his own skull mound. He felt organs rupture, felt blood flood his innards. He screamed in the faces of the creatures ripping him apart, words choked with his own vitae. "See me," he howled. "Damn you, see me." No light descended. No apotheosis reached for him. There was only chitin and tooth and hunger, tearing him into chunks and swallowing them. His bones joined the countless others ground under Tyranid tread. His armor was stripped, melted down in digestion pools, its corrupted machine spirit's last protest, becoming just another chemical twitch in a vat of dissolving ore. His hate ended in the stomach of a beast that would never remember him. Elsewhere, in the collapsing underhives, the last human voices were being snuffed out. Lictors moved through the dark with the unhurried patience of professional killers. Their chameleonic hides rippled, matching the corroded metal and fungal growths around them. Their feeder tendrils tested the air, tasting sweat, fear, blood, stale promethium fumes, and the faint ozone tang of failing power cells. When they found concentrations of prey, they marked them with invisible psychic tags and waited. Genestealers did the harvesting. They slipped down maintenance shafts and along forgotten transit tunnels, claws clicking lightly on steel. Their bodies moved with inhuman grace, flowing around obstacles like water-given blades. They had no need of light. Their senses traced the smallest vibrations, the faintest exhalations. A last stronghold might consist of a handful of families crammed into a refuse compactor, walls reinforced with scrap. A single stolen laser gun passed between them. They would sit in the dark, listening to distant sounds, whispering to half-remembered saints or to darker things. The first they would know of the end would be the hiss of something sliding between the plates of the door. Claws punched through improvised barricades. Vents that had seemed too small for anything larger than a sump rat suddenly bulged as a genestealer forced its way through, carapace scraping, limbs folding until they snapped out in a spray of rust flakes and blood. It took one adult first, jaws closing around a neck, teeth meeting with a crack that sent a spray of arterial blood across the others. Children screamed. Lass bolts flashed, wild and panicked, burning tracks across the alien hides, but rarely killing. The creatures dragged their prey back the way they had come, into vents and access ways that stank of old oil and new meat. Those captives died quickly, if not kindly, in digestion pools, their bodies broken down into fuel for more perfect predators. Cries for help stopped echoing in the underhive. Soon, even the memory of human voices faded from those darknesses, replaced by the soft rustle of feeder tendrils and the wet burble of digestion. Above, in the thin envelope between planet and void, the hive ships worked. Charybdis's surviving bioships rode low over the scarred globe, linked to its surface by cables of living tissue. Within their cavernous innards, Norn queens hung in seas of nutrient broth, their bloated bodies twitching as they processed the feast. Tubes fed them every flavor the planet had offered. Warp touched flesh from summoners and sorcerers, thick with the residue of demon contact. Armor fragments charred by warp flame, the oils in their fibers forever altered by exposure to unreality. Diseased organs from plague marines, swollen with toxins that had delighted Nurgle and rotted whole regiments elsewhere. All of it flowed into the Queen's bodies, was tasted, considered, broken down. They were not gods. They could not be corrupted in the sense that chaos understood, because there was no self there for the warp to seduce. There was only function, but they could extrapolate. They adjusted spawning vats, altering ratios of enzyme and acid, modifying the shapes of new organs. Certain strains of gaunt were given thicker carapaces along their spines to better resist warp fire. New venting structures were grown into the skulls of synapse creatures, subtle channels to bleed away excess psychic heat in regions where the immaterium ran hot. Biotoxins were quietly tweaked, their interactions with diseased flesh noted and refined. Zarakthos had been a shrine to the corpse god. It had tried to become a demon world. It ended as a laboratory. Far away, astropaths flinched. There had always been a noise from Zarakthos, a constant shriek in the warp. Not malign, but insistent. The combined prayers of billions, the hum of its reactors, the presence of its relics, and traces of holy blood. It had been a point of brightness, painful to look at directly, easy to use as a navigational mark. During the Chaos occupation, that brightness had become a different kind of screech, a red wound in the immaterium that psychers avoided unless compelled by duty or madness. Astropaths had reported nightmares of chains and teeth, of saints flayed and reassembled into altars. Some had gone blind, their eyes seared by visions of a world trying to tear itself in half. Then, one day, they reached for it and found nothing. No beacon, no wound, not even static. Just a smooth, cold absence, as if someone had taken a blade and shaved that part of the warp clean. Choirs on distant black ships murmured uneasily, feeling the missing snarl. Rogue trader navigators marked their charts, noting that a once reliable reference point was now a quiet blank. In the screaming halls of the Astronomicon, bound psychers thrashed as a minor note dropped out of the endless song. Heretical circles noticed as well. Warpsmiths and covens who had touched the edge of the Zarakthos rite felt a thread snap in their workings. They read the absence as betrayal or failure or warning. A demon prince in the Eye of Terror who had invested centuries of whispers and dreams into turning Zarakthos into his personal throne world, felt the rug of potential ripped from under him. Minor warp entities and petty godlings wailed in frustration. They had flocked to the planet like scavengers around a fresh corpse, drawn by the promise of worship, fear, and blood. They had imagined themselves carving out niches in the new demon world, feasting on the constant flow of sacrificial souls and mortal horror. Instead, they watched as all that psychic energy, all that carefully cultivated terror, all that devotion and blasphemy was transmuted into chemical fuel for beasts that could not even taste it. It was not a wound. The gods were too vast to be truly harmed by the loss of a single world's promise. It was an insult, a philosophical slap in the face, proof that there existed in the galaxy a form of damnation that did not care for their games at all. In the eye, things that had always believed themselves central to the universe's suffering shuddered at the idea that they might be, in a sense, irrelevant. The Charybdis tendril of the great hive fleet swelled with its harvest. Bioships that had been lean and scarred were now heavy with processed matter. Their bellies bulged, their exoskeletons flexing to accommodate the increased volume of vats and gestation pools. Patterns of bioluminescent signal along their flanks shifted, reflecting new instructions, new substrains, new weapons. The fleet altered course. Zarakthos dwindled behind them, a cracked husk wrapped in skeletal capillary towers that no longer pulsed. There were scraps left upon it, bones ground into glassy grit, patches of meat clinging to the shadowed sides of deep craters, a few pockets of stubborn life hiding in shielded bunkers. They were not worth the fuel it would cost to strip them. The tendril slid back into the dark, guided now not only by the crude lure of biomass, but by the fine tastes it had acquired. It was, by some fractional degree, more prepared to traverse warp-tainted regions, more ready to convert demonic interference into useful data. Someone would mark the passing, eventually. In a hidden archive built into the hollowed spine of a dead void beast, a radical inquisitor, or perhaps a dark mechanicus archivist, set quill to data slates and etched a record. Zarakthos, they wrote, had been a case study in competing damnations. On one side, the warp, with its lies and promises, its beautiful horrors and personal apotheoses. Chaos had come to the world with banners of fire and iron, offering liberation from the corpse throne in exchange for obedience to older, hungrier gods. It had desecrated, corrupted, sacrificed, and schemed to turn the planet into a shrine to unreason. On the other, the void, with its patient hunger. The Tyranids had no dogma, no sermons, no rituals beyond the simple calculus of consumption. They wrought horrors as a matter of process, not art. They did not care who knelt, who cursed, who begged. They ate. On Zarakthos, the chronicler concluded, the simpler damnation proved more enduring. The record ended there. Out in the deep between stars, the view widened. The system that had once held Zarakthos grew quiet. Its void stations were gone, its defense fleet shredded. Its traffic beacons and prayer towers were silent. The only movement was the slow procession of a living curtain of bioships as they turned their bloated hulls away from the husk and toward new prey. Against that curtain, the stars dwindled, their light swallowed by the chitinous silhouettes. Then Charybdis was gone, its bulk translated into that other ocean, leaving behind only warped radiation and a dead orbit where a shrine world had once shone. In the far future of the 41st millennium, there were countless ways to throw a soul away. One could spend it on a god's whim, burn it in service to a dying empire, trade it for a moment of power or spite. Zarakthos had found another path. It had given every saint, every sinner, every sacrifice and hope to teeth that did not care. In the end, even gods and the things that wanted to be gods could be rendered into food.